Hi folks, welcome to Code Complete. Today we'll be learning how to make a fully functional real-time chat application. Using our application, users will be able to send messages to their friends in real time who will be notified immediately whenever the message is received. To start a new conversation, users will be able to add new friends. We will be adding input validation to all of our forms, as well as a toast system to show notifications. Users will also have the ability to create group chats and send messages in them. As you can see, we will also have real-time read receipts so that you know whenever a user has read your message. Of course, users will have the option to leave groups and delete them, as well as remove any friends that they have. Our app will be completely responsive and will have a separate mobile layout as well. And we will also be building a theme switcher so that we can enable dark mode. In the end, we will also take a look at how to deploy our app completely for free using Vercel. We will be using a cutting-edge tech stack to make this application. Our app will be built using React and Next.js. If you've never used Next.js, don't worry. We'll begin by going over the basics so that you're all set up to create this full stack application. We'll use Tailwind CSS for styling, and we'll be using Shadcn components to build out our application. And for our database, we'll be using Convex, which is a real-time database which enables us to send real-time messages, and we'll be using Clerk for authentication. All of these are in-demand skills and technologies, and we'll be using them to make our chat app responsive, real-time, and robust. Everything that was mentioned is there for free in this tutorial, but as a part of the full course, we will be adding loads more features to take our chat app to the next level. We'll begin by adding an emoji picker and then add support for image, video, and file uploads. Like all chat apps out in the market, we will be adding an audio and video call feature between users as well as groups. And we will end by turning our chat app into a progressive web app, which means it can be downloaded on both your desktop and your phone and be used like a native application. The link below in the description will actually give you a 30% discount on this additional content. So do check it out. But without further ado, let's get started. So to get started, we'll open up VS Code where we want to make our project. And we'll start setting up our Next.js project to begin with. So we have the getting started guide open up over here for Next.js. And to begin with, you want to make sure you have the system requirements. And to make sure that you have Node installed, just do node-v. And you should get a number over here, which is the version of Node you have. If we come down over here, the easiest way to set up a new Next.js project is to just copy this command that's written over here and paste it in your terminal. Now it'll ask you a few questions. So the first thing is the project name that we want to give it. So we'll just say chat-app. Then we'll go with the defaults for mostly everything. So for TypeScript, we'll say yes. For ESLint, we'll say yes as well. We want to use Tailwind. We do not want to use the src directory for our project, and we do want to use the app router. And we'll just say no for this one. And then after some time, it'll complete setting up the boilerplate for your Next.js project. So once the script is done running, you'll see you have a new folder over here called chat app, and you have a bunch of files inside it. Don't worry if you don't know what these are and you've never worked with Next.js before. We'll be going over everything you need to know about Next.js in the next section. For now, all you need to do is in the terminal write cd chat-app to go into the folder where your project is, and just type npm run dev, which will start the project. Once that's ready, you can just copy this URL over here and paste it over here. And we can see the sample website that Next.js has created for us using the script we just ran. One more thing we need to do while setting up is setting up our component library, which is Shadcn. Now, unlike other component libraries like Bootstrap or Semantic UI, you don't actually install all of Shadcn into your project. Shadcn is different because all of the code inside it is customizable and you only copy paste the components which you really need. If that doesn't make sense right now, you'll get used to it once we start working on the app. But trust me, it's really nice to use and it makes development a lot easier. So to set it up, we'll go to the Next.js installation steps for Shadcn. And the first step is to create our next app, which we did in the previous part. Next, we need to copy this command for initializing Shadcn in our project. So we'll just stop our server inside the terminal over here, and we'll paste this command and run it. So once that's done running, it'll ask us a few questions. So for the styling, we want to go with default because if we go with New York, we won't get some icons that we need. So we'll say default. We'll just carry on with slate for now as the base color. And we do want to use CSS variables, so we'll say yes. Now you won't see many changes, but if you open up the app folder and you go into globals.css, you'll see a bunch of variables have been created for our project, which will be used when styling the different components which we install. And of course, since it's in globals.css, everything is customizable, so you can already begin to see how customizable Shadcn is. So let's go back and restart our server by writing npm run dev. And if we go back to the tab and if we refresh, we see that nothing has changed. So to begin seeing the changes from Shadcn, we'll firstly go into page.tsx. If you don't know what this is, don't worry for now, we'll cover that in the next section. But for now, just remove everything. And over here, we'll just create a p tag which says hello world and save that. So that simplifies everything. And we'll also remove the image over here. Now we just installed a component library and we want to use some of the components inside it. But the thing is we didn't actually install any components yet. We just set up the boilerplate for Shadcn. Whenever you want to install a component from Shadcn, you need to go to their website. And on the left hand side, you'll be able to see a bunch of components which they have over here. And you can individually install the component that you need. So for now, we'll just install the button. So we'll click on the button option over here. And you see that there's a simple command over here written down for you, which you can just copy. We'll close our server and just paste this command. And once that's done installing, we'll just npm run dev again. But what you'll now see is that inside the components folder, inside the UI folder, there's a file called button.tsx, which has been populated for you by Shadcn. And you can see all of the styling applied to the button component and the different props you can pass to it, such as the variant, the size, and the default values for the variant and the size. And you can see the interface and you can also see how it's defined. So if you wanted to change any of the style, you could just go over here and change it yourself. And it's pretty easy to use as well. So let's go back into page.tsx and remove everything over here. And we'll just start writing button and we can see that we can auto import it. So we'll auto import it and we'll just say hello world over here and save it. If we go back to our app and refresh, we see that the button has been created and it has the different styling. And we saw that there are different variants. So we'll include a variant property. And for now, let's say destructive. And you can see that the styling changes automatically and it's given to us by Shadcn. And of course, if we wanted to change the background color for the destructive variant, we could just go over here and we see destructive. And instead of doing BG destructive, we could just do BG blue 100 and save that. And you can see that it's easily customizable. So let's undo that. Now, one last thing we want to do is set up the theme for our entire website. So we'll go back into the Shadcn website and click on the themes option. And we can see that we can customize the theme over here. So let's go with default, but for the color, we'll choose blue because our app's primary color will be blue. We'll keep the border radius as 0.5 and we'll just go with light for now. And we can see that everything over here has changed and this is kind of what our website will look like. We can copy all of the styling from here. And then in globals.css, all of the variables that were defined over here, we'll just replace those with what we have copied. And if we go back into our app and for our button in page.tsx, remove the variant, we see that it's a blue button now. So that's it for the Shadcn setup. We'll be adding a bunch more different components from it, but you can see how useful it is and how easy it is to customize. So if you're new to Next.js and you've never used it before, or you need a refresher on how Next.js works, in this section, we'll be just going over the basics so that you're prepared for making this chat application. But if you already know the basics and you know how Next.js works, feel free to move on to the next section. So firstly, why do we need Next.js? Well, if you've ever built a React application that was full stack, you know that we need a bunch of different dependencies and libraries to make it. So if you use the MERN stack, we know we need to build an Express server in the backend. And then even at the front end, we need stuff like React Router to enable routing in our entire application. And it's just a bunch of stuff that you need to install and set up. And it basically combines everything that you need to build a full app from the front to the back. So routing is built into Next.js, and you can also create the entire backend through Next.js without needing to install something like Express.js. So just to summarize, Next.js just makes React full stack development a lot easier. So now that we know that, let's just take a look at the different folders that were generated by Next.js for us when we ran that command. So we'll ignore the components and the lib folder because we made that when installing Shadcn and creating the lib for the utils. But the two main folders that we care about is the app folder and the public folder. So the public folder is pretty simple. It just contains static assets like images and SVGs, which can be used in our application. But the main content of our application is stored inside this app folder over here. This is where all our front-end routes and front-end pages go. And the files here basically tell our application what to render at each URL inside our application. This will make sense later on, but just know that the app folder is where we'll be doing most of our coding. Next, we have some top level files. So firstly, we have the next.config.js or MJS, and this just contains configuration details of how our Next.js project will work. We'll be editing this a bit later on. Package.json you will probably be familiar with if you've ever built a React or Node application, and it contains a list of our dependencies and different commands that we have. We will be creating a middleware.ts file that's mentioned on the right hand side inside the Next.js documentation. And this is just some code that gets run on every page load, and we can do some stuff like checking for authentication and stuff like that so that we can redirect the user if they're not logged in. And the rest of the files, such as the tsconfig and then the post css config, are not important for us to discuss right now. But if you ever want to change any configuration for your CSS or for your TypeScript, you can take a look at these quick files. So the next thing we need to take a look at is the routing convention. So I mentioned that Next.js has routing built into it. It uses something called a file-based routing system. And this basically means that the way you arrange your files and folders inside this app folder defines the different routes in your application. So inside the app folder, you will see something called page.tsx. And what page.tsx does is that it tells Next.js the code to render at a particular URL. So since this page.tsx is right in the app folder, this defines what to render in the home page. So again, if we take a look at our application, we see that we are rendering a button at page.tsx, and the URL is just /. So if we render /, we just see the button which is at page.tsx. Before we expand on this further, we need to take a look at layout.tsx. And what layout.tsx does is that it defines what to render at the current route as well as every sub route. To make this point clearer, let's make a new folder over here and let's just name this user. So we have a folder called user, and then let's create a page.tsx there as well. And let's copy the code we had over here. We can define this anything. We can name this as anything. So let's name this as user, and let's just create an h1 over here and say this is the user page. Now we see we have a folder called /user and we have a page.tsx inside that. So we would expect that when we go to /user, we see that the code that we have over here is rendered out as this is the user page. So we can begin to see that if we had any nested folders and we had page.tsx there as well, we would be able to see that by going to there using the path in our URL. This brings us to the next file type, which is layout.tsx, which is another reserved keyword by Next.js. And what this does is that it basically is used to define a wrapper which is rendered for a given path and for every subpath inside it. So if we went back to the home page, and if over here above children we added some text such as this is being rendered in the layout, we will see it not only rendered in the home page because it is the layout for the home page, but if we go to /user, we will see it being rendered here as well. So again, layout.tsx basically defines what to render at a given path as well as every child path of it. This is especially useful if you're making something such as a navbar or a footer and you want it applied to every child page. And page.tsx and layout.tsx are the main two files that we'll be using throughout our application. So these are the only ones we care about. But you can see that we have a bunch more reserved file types which are rendered in different scenarios, such as the error.tsx, which is rendered whenever there's an error on a page. So let's go to nested routes. We saw that there was a user nested route and we could render page.tsx. Let's try it again and create a settings route and create a page.tsx there as well. And let's just paste what we have and name this settings and say p settings. And if we go to /user/settings, we see the settings page. So you can see that it can be as nested as you want and it will still work. That makes sense, but what if we want a dynamic route as is mentioned over here, where we want to see the details of a particular user. So we'll give the user ID of 12345 and we want to see the details of this user. Of course, we don't have a folder defined for that, but also we want this to be dynamic. So whatever user ID we give over here, we want to render the details of that user. So in these cases where the path can be dynamic, we'll go into this folder and we will say square bracket user ID and then close the square bracket and create the page.tsx. We'll define the code for a page and say user details. So we can put anything over here. So we'll just say p and user details. And now we see that even though the route is dynamic, we can render the user details. So even if this was like a random number, we would render the same page. But what if you actually want to get the ID that's in the URL and fetch the details of that given user? What you can do is in the props, Next.js will give us an object called params. And inside the params will be a field called user ID. Let's just define the type as props equal to params, which is an object which contains user ID of type string. And let's just say this is equal to props type. Now this is equal to user ID because that's what we defined inside the square brackets. We could have named it anything and then we would use this value in here. but now we can render it over here, the user ID. And now we can see that whatever we pass in the URL, it's dynamic and it's being rendered out. So let's do another number and we see it's being rendered out. So that's how you do dynamic routes if you have something like a conversation ID or a user ID. The next thing we can do is actually group the different routes. So we saw that folders are being used to organize the different paths in the URL. But if you just want to collect a bunch of different folders and you don't want the parent folder to represent a route, so let's just inside user create a folder and put it inside parentheses and say user pages, and then move user ID into that and move settings into that as well, and open that up. And if we refresh, we will see everything works as before. And that's because if you have any folders with the parentheses around it, it's not counted in the URL. And this is pretty useful if you're trying to organize the different folders and files inside your app folder. Now that's if you don't want this folder's name to be in the URL, but if you want to create a folder where nothing inside it is a part of the URL, what you can do is create an underscore components. And the fact that it starts with an underscore means that anything inside this won't be the part of a URL. So we could make a page.tsx inside this, and we could render a function like this. But if we go to user slash underscore components, it won't render anything. So it's still considering this as a user ID and rendering that instead. Now we mentioned layout.tsx, but the layout.tsx inside the app folder directly is a special type of layout. It's called the root layout. The font that we're using, which is enter in this case, as well as the body tag and the HTML tag, which won't be present in any other layout. So now that we're done explaining how pages and routes work in Next.js, let's just delete everything we just made because we won't be using this in the final steps. Now, one last thing you need to know about Next.js is the difference between client-side rendering and server-side rendering. So client-side rendering basically means that you're basically sent a skeleton of what the page should look like, and all the data fetching and populating of the fields is actually done by your browser on the laptop or desktop that you're viewing the website on. This is how React works by default and how single page applications work. But then we have server-side rendering, where all of the elements and the data fetching for a certain web page are done by the server wherever the website is being stored, and the client gets the entire page pre-populated. So your browser doesn't have to do any data fetching and populating of the data. It just gets every text and image predefined. So Next.js does this by default. It does server-side rendering by default. And this is because it's faster, since the client has to do less work of fetching any data and rendering. And any data that is needed is probably close anyways to the server where the website is stored. So the data fetching is faster as well. But since everything is being fetched beforehand by the server, it does mean that nothing can be interactive. So if we try adding something like use state or use effect, which depends on user input, it will give an error. So let's just try that inside our homepage. Let's go to our homepage, and on the top, let's just say const a set a is equal to use state, and let's just set false initially and open up the inspect element and go into console, and let's just import use state and save that. We see that we get a huge error, and it's saying you're importing a component that needs use state. It only works in a client component. And what we currently have is not a client component because again, Next.js by default uses server component. So to make sure use state and use effect and any other hooks can work in any of our files or component, whenever we need to add something like this, we will go to the top, create a string which says use client and save that. And now we see that the error has disappeared because we basically told Next.js, hey, this page is being client-side rendered, so don't try to render it. Just wait for it to reach the browser, and then the browser will render it. So this might be a bit confusing, but as you build Next.js applications, this just comes with time and you begin to understand when you need client component. So again, usually if you want interactivity or like event listeners, you should use client components. Otherwise, you can just go with server components. So those are the basics of Next.js you need to know before we start building our application. The rest you will understand as we start building. But yes, those are the basics. So now we can get actually started with building our application. And the first step is actually setting up our database and our authentication. Next, we'll be setting up our database. And for that, we'll be using a real-time database called Convex, which makes database management a lot easier than using Prisma and the MongoDB stuff you've probably seen before. So to get started, you want to go to convex.dev and you want to log in, and it will probably use your GitHub for that. And once you set up your account, you see I have a few projects from before. You want to go to the Next.js quick start documentation. And of course, firstly, they tell us to create our next project. Then you have to do npm install convex inside your project. So we'll go to a new tab, again, cd into chat app, and we'll say npm install convex. And once that's done installing, we'll copy this command npx convex dev. And this single command will not only set up your database and connect it to your app, you want to keep it running because any changes you make to the schema or any backend changes you make, this will automatically update it with the cloud so that you don't need to do anything from your end. You just need to change the code in your app and it will automatically get updated. So we'll say npx convex dev and we want to configure a new project. The project name will be chat app. And then if you go into env.local, which has been created, it has added some environment variables connected to your Convex project. And since everything is connected via Git and GitHub, it already knew which account is related to this project. So now if we go back into the dashboard, we see that there's a new project called Chat App. And if we click on it, it opens up the project. And over here, we should be able to see the different schemas and the tables that we have. Right now, we don't have anything, so it's empty. And another useful page is the logs page over here. So whenever you're running your app and there are any errors, they'll get logged out over here. And it's very useful to figure out what's going wrong. So for now, that's it for the database. Next, we want to set up authentication and authorization for our app. And for that, we'll be using a service called Clerk, which makes it a lot easier to manage the users in your application. So if you go to clerk.com, you can click on Start Building for free, which will allow you to create a new account. I already have an existing account over here. So what you need to do is go to the top left and click on Create Application. And we'll just write the application as Chat App. And for the sign-in options, we'll be allowing the user to sign in just using Google. So you want to deselect email as well. And this is the page that the user will see when they go to our application, and we'll click on Create Application. Now, the great thing about Clerk is that as soon as you make an application, it gives you all the information you need to get set up. So we have Next.js selected over here, and it's telling us to copy these keys and paste them into our .env.local. So we'll just copy them over here, go into our .env.local, and just say that these are the Clerk related keys, and just paste them down below over here. And then we can just click on the continue to the Next.js guide over here. And the great thing is that it will populate all of the fields with the information related to your project. So the first thing it's telling us to do is to install clerk/Next.js. So we'll copy that. We'll go back to our terminal. Keep in mind, you need to keep the convex command running all the time so that your DB is always updated in regards to the schema and everything. So we'll create a new terminal and again cd into chat-app and we'll install clerk/Next.js. And now that that's done, a quick tip in VS Code, you can actually rename all of the different terminals that you have. So for this one, I'll just rename it to Convex, and this one, I'll rename it to Server so that we just know what each one is doing. We'll go back here, and then we've done this step already where we copy paste the environment variables. Number 3, where we make the Clerk provider, we're going to skip this for now because we want to integrate Convex with Clerk. And for that, we'll be making a separate provider. And now it's telling us to add some middleware to our project. What this lets us do is that this function will check every single page that the user visits, and based on our configuration, it will know whether the page is available to the public who aren't signed in or if the page is protected and if the user needs to sign in before they can see it. So in our case, all of our pages will be protected, but if you in case had a home page or a blog page which you wanted everyone to see, you would add it over here. So we'll just copy the code over here, and inside chat app in the root directory, we'll create a new file called middleware.ts, and we'll just paste this in over here. I'll just delete this comment over here, and in place of that, just include a simple forward slash and delete this comment over here as well. For now, the auth middleware object will be empty, and delete this as well. And we'll just go save that. So that's it for the Clerk setup. Next, we'll integrate Clerk with Convex. So now we'll be working on integrating Convex with Clerk. And this is for 2 reasons. Firstly, because we want our Clerk user information inside our Convex backend. And also because we need to create providers for both our Clerk user information in the front end, as well as some Convex stuff, such as the different queries we'll be making. And the Convex docs make it really easy to integrate both of them together. So we'll go to the Convex docs for working with Clerk. And the first step is to create your Clerk account and your application. The next step is to create a JWT template inside Clerk. So we'll go to our Clerk project and we'll click on this JWT templates tab, and we'll click on new template, and we'll just select Convex because that's what we're using for the backend. And we'll keep everything the same as the default. We'll just go to the issuer over here and just copy that value because we'll use that later. And we'll go to the bottom and we'll just go ahead and click on save changes. What we need to do next is go into auth.config.ts in our project. So we need to create that file inside the convex folder. We'll click on new file and say auth.config.ts and then paste in the rest of the stuff over here and replace the domain with what we had copied before. So this is the domain for our Clerk project, and save that. What we want to do next is go back into the documentation and go down to step number 8, which is creating the actual provider, which will protect our entire app behind authentication and also add a sign-in page hosted by Clerk. So we'll go into the main folder and create a new folder called providers, and we'll create a new file called convex client provider.tsx. We'll just use a short command called tsrafce and save that. By the way, if you want to see the different extensions I have on my VS Code, you can take a look over here, and they're pretty useful when developing Next.js and React projects. So let's go back into our project over here, and the tsrafce just creates some boilerplate React component. For the props, we want to include children, and that will be react.react node, and we'll take in the children over here by destructuring, and we'll delete this div stuff over here, and the outermost element will be a clerk provider. Inside that we have a convex provider with clerk, and all of these are being auto imported by VS Code. And then inside that we'll just render the children that we have. Now you'll see that it's red over here, and that's because we need to pass in a few values. So firstly, we have a prop called use auth, which we will get from clerk, and we pass that in. And secondly is the client, and we need to create the client. So outside our component, we'll say const convex, which will be the client, and we'll say it's a new convex React client. Now this takes in the convex URL for our project, and we haven't defined that. So we'll say const convex URL, and that is equal to process.env.next public convex URL. And if that doesn't exist, just use an empty string as a default. And we'll pass in that into convex provider with clerk. So as a summary, we have a clerk provider on the outside. Inside that, we have a convex provider. And to integrate it with clerk, we pass in the use auth function given to us by clerk. And we also get the domain for our convex project, and we pass it in as the client prop. Now to actually use this provider, we'll go back into the app folder and layout.tsx. And if you remember, this basically wraps our entire project. So this is the perfect place to put our provider. We'll say convex client provider, and we will wrap the children inside it. So now if we try to go to localhost 3000, you'll see that instead of the button that we had and a home page, we actually see a sign-in page given to us by Clerk, and it prompts us to continue with Google. So we'll just click on that. And we now see that we're logged in, and it's giving us an error, and that's because inside our provider, you'll see that by using different front-end only capabilities such as hooks like use auth. So what we need to do at the top, as you learned, is include use client to make this a client component and save that. And now we see that we are behind the authentication middleware, and we can actually see the home page. Now we want to create a loading state for when the user is being logged in via Clerk and there's nothing on the page to load. So we'll go to a website called logoipsum.com, and we'll select one of the icons over here. So for this project, we'll be using this icon, and you can actually download the SVG. So we'll go ahead and download that, and we'll copy it from our folder, and inside the public folder in our project, we'll go ahead and paste it, and we'll just rename it to logo.svg. Now we'll be creating our first component which gets rendered to the user. So inside the components folder, we'll create a new folder called shared, and we'll create a component called loading logo.tsx. As before, I'll just write tsrafce, and that creates the loading logo. We will be using import image from next image, and this is an image that will be shown to the user while the page is loading. For the props, we just want one prop, which is the size, and it's optional, and that'll be a number, and it'll be the size of our icon. And we'll say size is equal to 100 by default. For the outside div, we'll give it a class name, and we'll say the height should be full, width should be full, flex, justify center, and items center. And then inside, we'll render an image the src will be /logo.svg, and the files given to image components are usually in relation to the public folder. For the alt, we'll just say logo. For the width, it'll be equal to the size. Height will also be equal to the size. And then for the class name, we'll say animate dash pulse, which adds a pulsing animation to it via Tailwind. And for duration, we'll give it 800. So it'll take 800 seconds. So it'll take 800 milliseconds for the animation to cycle through. Now we made the component, we need to actually use it somewhere. So in Convex Client Provider, we're just rendering the children for now, but we can have two states. We can have an authenticated state, and we can have an auth loading state. Of course, in the authenticated state, we want to render out the children, but when it's auth loading, we want to render out the loader which we had right now. So we'll say loading logo, and we'll use the default size and save that. And now if we refresh, we see the logo, but the issue is that it's at the top. So to fix that, what we can do is go into globals.css, and at the top, just say HTML, body, set the height for that equal to 100%, and set the overflow equal to hidden. Save that. And if we refresh now, we see that we have a central loading icon, and then we load the page once the authentication is done. Now to actually test out that we have the user information on the front end and the user is actually authenticated, we'll go into page.tsx and remove this button and at the top as well. And Clerk actually provides us with a component called user button, which we'll import and render that out over here. And we see now that the user's avatar is rendered over here, given to us by Google. And if we click on it, we can see the name, the email, manage account, and we can sign out as well. Let's do that. And you can see that we've been signed out. And again, we're at the sign in page. We can't go to localhost 3000 because we'll be redirected to the sign in page. And if we sign in again, we see the loading page and then the user button again. So authentication completely works now with Clerk and Convex integrated together. So I promise this is the last step of the setup before we get started with the UI. But what we need to do is whenever a user signs up to our application via Clerk, we also want to store that user's information in Convex. Because although we're using Clerk for authentication, we need some information about the users inside Convex so that we can add friends, create conversation and stuff like that. And to do that, we need to enable webhooks inside Clerk. So what will happen is whenever a user gets created in Clerk, it'll trigger this webhook to Convex, and then Convex will create the new user in its own local database. So to enable webhooks, we'll go back into our project and go into the webhooks tab, and we'll click on this button which says add endpoint. And this is the endpoint which will get a notification whenever a new user is created in Clerk. So to do that, we'll go back into Convex, and inside settings, we'll get the URL by clicking on show development credentials and copying the URL over here, which is the deployment URL. We'll go back into Clerk and we'll paste that over here. We need to make some minor changes. So replace this .cloud with .site, put a / and say Clerk users webhook. And this is a webhook we'll be defining in our own code. For the filters, we'll search for the user filters and select all of them. And we'll click on create, and we'll just copy the signing secret over here. We'll go into .env.local, and at the bottom over here, we'll create a new variable called clerk webhook secret and say it's equal to this value. And we need to also add it to Convex. So we'll go back into our Convex project, and inside settings, environment variables, we'll add clerk webhook secret and add the value and save. Next, we'll go into our terminal and say npm install swix, which just has some helper functions when it comes to webhooks, which we'll be needing right now. And now that that's done, we'll be creating our first schema for our database, which is the users table. So we'll open up the Convex folder over here and create a new file called schema.ts. And firstly, we want to say export default, and then we want to use the define schema function. And it's not being imported for some reason, so we'll import it at the top. We'll say import define schema and define table from convex/server. Now this takes in an object, and each value will be a different table in our database, and the convention is to use plural values for the object, so it's the users table. And now we'll define the table. So firstly, we have the username field, which will be v.string, and v is a variable imported from convex/values. And it basically allows us to define the type of a field. So username is v.string, image URL is also v.string. Then we have clerk ID v.string because we want to maintain a mapping between our convex user and our clerk user. And then we have email, which is v.string as well. Next, we want to add different indexes, which make it easier to search for a user and make it more optimized. So we want the user to be searchable by their email. So we'll say dot index and we'll say by underscore email. That's the name of the index. And then we'll pass in an array of values that can be used for this index. So we'll be using the email value for this. And the great thing about Convex is that you can just chain different indexes. So we'll say dot index again, and we'll say by clerk ID. And for that, of course, we'll be using the clerk ID field. And we'll go ahead and save that. And if you open up the Convex terminal over here, you'll see that it's doing some computation. And if we go into our data tab over here now, and my mistake, this should be schema.ts. And if you go into the data tab of your Convex dashboard, you can see now that there's a users table defined and it's automatically updated. Now, whenever we create a different entity, such as user over here, we can also create a file with that name and define any operations we can run on that entity in the database. So since we define the user, we'll create a file called user.ts. And we need to do two things. Firstly is create a user and then also get a user based on their clerk ID. So we'll firstly say export const create, and that will be an internal mutation. And we'll import that from Convex. So we'll say import internal mutation and internal query from /generated/server. And in Convex, we have two types of operations. They're either internal or external. Internal mutations and internal queries can just be run by other Convex functions, while normal external mutations and queries can be run by our front end. And since only our backend will be creating users, we want to just create internal mutations. And since only our backend will be getting the user data from here, we'll create an internal query. So we'll say args, and again, username is a v.string, image URL is v.string, clerk ID is v.string, and email is v.string. So that's the first parameter. Secondly is the handler, which is the function that we pass. It's an async and it takes in two parameters, context and args. And we'll just say await ctx.db.insert. We want to insert it into the users table and we want to pass in the args that we have. And of course, we need to import the v. So we import it from convex/values. So that's for creating a user. We also want to get a user based on that clerk ID. So we'll say export const get is equal to internal query. Args is just the clerk ID, and that's v.string. And then we have the async handler, which takes the ctx and args. We return ctx.db. Now we want to query the users table, so we'll say dot query. So before we did an insert, but this is querying, so the users table. And then on that output, we want to use an index, so we'll do with index. We want to say by clerk ID q, which is the query, and we'll say q dot equal the clerk ID is equal to args dot clerk ID. And since we want to just get one, we'll say dot unique. And just to recap, what we're doing is we're querying the users table, and we're saying, and since we want a particular user based on their clerk ID, we need to use a specific index. Thankfully, we created the by clerk ID index in our schema. So what we can say is take the query, and what you want to do is find the element where the clerk ID is equal to the args.clerk ID, and we're using q.equal for that. And since we just want one value, we'll say dot unique. So now we have two ends of what we need. On the clerk side, we have a webhook which will be calling a certain endpoint whenever a user gets created. And on Convex, we have two functions which will either create a user or get the current user. We need to connect the two. And basically that means we need to create an HTTP endpoint which will accept whatever the webhook sends it, and it will call the create function. So to do that inside Convex, we'll create another special file called http.ts. And again, this is like a reserved file name. And we'll basically create a server over here. So we'll say const HTTP is equal to HTTP router, which is sent to us by Convex. And we want to say HTTP dot route. So we're creating a route. The path is slash clerk dash users dash webhook. So if you remember, this is the URL that we passed to Clerk. So basically, whenever the webhook gets run in Clerk, whenever a user signs up, it'll send a request to this HTTP endpoint in Convex. It will be sending a post request, and then to handle this request, we have handle Clerk webhook. And then at the bottom, export default HTTP. Now, of course, we haven't created this function over here, so we'll go over here and we'll say const handle clerk webhook is equal to, and it's an HTTP action, again given to us by Convex, async context and request. We first want to validate the payload and get the event information of whatever the webhook event is. So we'll say const event is equal to await validate payload and pass in the request. Again, this is a function which we have to make. So we'll just step out of this for a second and we'll say const validate payload is equal to async, take in the request, which is of type request, and we will be returning a promise of either webhook event type, which is given to us by Clerk, or undefined arrow function. And first we get the payload, so const payload is equal to await request dot text. So we're converting the requests data into dot text. We'll get the Sphinx headers, which is sent to us by Clerk. And this is also the library which we install. So Sphinx headers. First is Sphinx-id. That is request.headers.get and Sphinx-id. I'll just copy this twice. And for each of these, we want to do exclamation mark to assert that each of these values will exist in the request. Secondly, we have Sphinx timestamp. And thirdly, we have Sphinx signature. And all of these are being sent by Clerk. So we can be assured of that. Const webhook and say new webhook and get that from Sphinx. And we'll say process.env.clerk webhook secret. And if that doesn't exist, just default to an empty string. And this is just creating a new webhook using the secret that we got from Clerk. And we create a try catch. Inside the try section, we'll say const event is equal to webhook dot verify the payload and the Sphinx headers and say as a webhook event. And if it gets validated, we'll just return that. But if it doesn't get verified, an error will be thrown and we'll say console.error clerk webhook request could not be verified. And we'll just return. So we have the validation of the payload. So we'll come back to our handle clerk webhook function over here. We want to say if there is no event, then return a new response and say could not validate clerk payload and say that status is 400. But if there is an event, then we want to see what type of event it is. So we'll say switch event.type, and this is a switch case. So the first case is user.created. In that case, we want to say const user is equal to await ctx.run query. And this will basically allow us to run any query which we have defined in Convex. And we did define one. It was in an internal query, internal.user, since that's the file name over here. And the function was called .get, if you remember. So inside we had a function called .get. And of course, we need to import internal. So we'll say import internal from /generated/API. So if a user is being created and if a user already exists with clerk ID equal to event.data.id. So if this user exists, then we want to say console.log updating user and string interpolation event.data.id with event.data. So in case a user already exists and we got the user created function, instead of throwing an error, we'll just update the user with the new data. So that will fall through to the next case, which is user.updated. And we'll say console.log creating / updating user. And we'll pass in event.data.id. And we'll say await ctx.run mutation. And again, in internal.user, we had create mutation, which we defined. And we'll create username, set that equal to some string interpolation. First value is event dot event.data.firstname, and of course, secondly is event.data.lastname. So that's how we'll define the username. For the image URL, we'll say event.data.image URL. And all of this data is being sent to us by Clerk. So the Clerk ID will be event.data.id. And then the email will be event.data.email addresses. Get the first one in the list and say dot email address. And then once that's done, we'll just break out of this. And as a default, we'll say console.log, and we'll just copy all of this in brackets and move this default up here. And we'll say clerk webhook event not supported and event.type. So all of this will get logged into Convex, and it'll be easy to see what errors there are in case there are any. And then we'll say return new response null, but say status is 200. And this is so just that Clerk knows that our endpoint is working and everything went properly. So we now have our backend set up so that now whenever a Clerk user is created, Convex will get the information of that user. And to verify that, we'll go back into Clerk, click on the users tab over here, and just go ahead and delete the current user which we have. And of course, our Convex data is empty. So let's open up localhost again as our user. And if we try to go to localhost 3000, of course, the user isn't logged in because their account was deleted. So we'll say continue with Google, click on their name, continue. And so they've been authenticated and logged in. If we go back into our Convex database, we now see that inside our users table, we actually have a field, and it is equal to the email which we signed in using, and we have the image URL and the username and the creation time. So we have finally set up our authentication and our database as well, and we've linked the two using the provider as well as the user information. Next up, we'll get started with the UI, and we'll work on the layout, the sidebar, and the navigation between the different pages. So before we begin working on the layout and the navigation and the sidebar, I just wanted to take you through the project once again and just show you how the layout and the different pages work. So as we can see, the default page for our application is the slash conversations path. And over here, we can see that there's no chat that's loaded up, but we do see the conversations tab over here, which renders out all of the chats which we have going on. We have the sidebar on the left, which has the different navigation capabilities. So if we click on this button over here, it takes us to slash friends. And again, no conversation is being rendered out, but the friends list is being rendered out. And if any request shows up, it'll show up over here. If we do want a conversation to render in the middle, we will have to go into our conversations list and click on the individual conversation, and now it loads up. But you'll also see that in the URL we have slash conversations slash and the ID of the conversation. So that's the layout and routing for the desktop view, but the mobile view is very different. So if we click on the mobile view navigator, you'll see that we have the navbar on the bottom now instead of on the side. So it's completely different. We don't have that gray box for an empty conversation. Instead, we just have the conversations list at slash conversations. Navigation works the same, where you can go to slash friends on the top. And if you want to go to a particular conversation, you have to click on it. And then the entire page is taken up by that particular conversation. And again, the URL is the same. So keeping all of this in mind, we'll now get started working on the layout and the navigation and the sidebar. So for the purpose of cleanliness, inside our app folder, we want to store all of our files inside a folder inside it called root. And we don't want this to be a part of the URL. So we'll say parentheses root, and we'll just take this page file and move it into the root folder. We can see that it's been added over there. And we actually don't want to return anything over here. So we'll just say return null. And that's because our default URL is slash conversations. So we don't want to render anything at the base URL. However, we do want a layout to be applied to our entire website. So inside the root folder, we'll create a new file called layout.tsx. Again, say tsrafce. For now, we just want to render out the children inside it. So we'll create an empty fragment and render out the children. We want to get that from the prop. And a cool trick you can do with React is that you don't have to each time define a children variable inside the props. You can do something like react.props with children and then pass in an object. And if you had any variables here like name, string, you could still add that. But the children field inside our props will be added automatically using props with children. So we'll pass in an empty object and then export the layout and wrap this with parentheses. Inside here, we will have a slash friends route. So we'll create a folder called friends and we'll create the page for that. So page.tsx, again tsrace. We'll just call this friends page for now. And now if you go to slash friends, we see that the friends page is rendered out. We'll also have a slash conversations as you saw. So we'll create a conversations folder alongside it and create the page.tsx for that as well. tsrace conversations page and save that. Again, if we go to slash conversations, the conversations page is rendered out. Particularly for the conversations path, we want to render a layout which gets applied not only to the conversations page, but also to a particular conversation when you add the slash ID. So we'll create another layout.tsx and say tsrace and say react.props with children and pass in an empty object. Rename this to conversations layout. And then inside here, just render out the children. And we'll take those in through the props. And then lastly, we want to render out a conversation for a particular ID at conversations/ID. So we'll create another folder, square bracket, since we want this to be dynamic, and say conversation ID inside there, and create a page.tsx, tsrace, conversation page, and save that. So right now at conversations, we have the conversations page, but if we add /1, it gets updated to the conversation page. So we have all of the folders and files which we'll be working with set up over here. One last thing is that if the user navigates to localhost 3000, we want them to go to /conversations automatically. And for that, we need to use something called redirects inside the Next.js config. So we'll go to the bottom and inside next.config.mjs, we'll add a field called async redirects. We'll return an array and we'll say the source is just /, and if the user visits this page, the destination should be /conversations. And we want this to always be true, so we'll say permanent true. We save that. And to make sure this works, we'll just shut down the server and restart it. And if we refresh our page, we see that we automatically get sent to /conversations. So that's it for the pages and routes setup. Next up, we'll be adding the sidebar. So to get started with the layout, we'll begin with the sidebar that's present on every page. And this goes for the desktop view where we have it on the side and for the mobile view where we have it on the bottom. So we'll go into the components folder and inside the shared folder, we'll make another folder called sidebar. And then we'll make a file called sidebar wrapper.tsx. We'll do tsrace. And this component will wrap around everything being rendered in our page, and it will render either the desktop navigation on the left-hand side, the mobile navigation on the bottom, as well as everything else, such as the chat and the list of conversations and friends inside it. So for the props, we'll say react.props with children, and we have to use angular brackets here. And then now over here, we can extract the children. And since we'll be rendering everything inside our page by passing it to this component, we'll render it inside here. Now on the outside div, we'll be adding some class names for Tailwind. So we want our entire application to be the full height of the screen as well as the full width. So we'll say h full and w full. We'll give it a padding of 4 on all sides. It'll be a flex box. It'll be flex column. But if the screen is larger than the LG size, then we want it to be flex row. And this makes our entire app responsive because in desktop view, everything goes from the left to the right, where we have the sidebar on the left and the content on the right. That's why we have flex row. But usually inside the mobile view, we want everything going from top to bottom. Then we'll begin by adding some class names to the outside div. So we want it to be h full and w full since our entire app must take up the full width and height of the page. We'll give it a p4 or all sides. It'll be a flex box. And the way classes work in Tailwind is that, and we want that to be a flex call because in mobile view, you'll notice that we have everything that goes from top to bottom. So we'll have the conversations list on the top and then the navbar below. In Tailwind, you can specify if you want a style to apply when it's larger than a certain width on the desktop. So we'll say LG, which means that if the width of the screen is larger than the LG size specified by Tailwind, then we actually want it to be a flex row. And that makes sense because we want the sidebar to be on the left instead of the bottom when we are on desktop. And we'll just put a gap of 4 between all the elements inside our sidebar wrapper. As for the children, we want to wrap it inside a main tag. So we'll take the children and we'll put it inside here and save it. We'll give it a class name. And by default, we want to calculate the height. So we'll use a custom height by putting the square brackets. And we want to use the CSS calc function, and we'll say take 100% of the page and subtract 80 pixels. And this 80 pixels is the actual height of the bottom navigation which we will be adding later on. So this is for the mobile view, but if the width is larger than LG, which means the desktop view, then we want it to be H. Of course, we want W full for either case. We want flex and gap of 4 between each element, and save that. Now we want to actually use the sidebar wrapper. So we'll go inside the layout.tsx inside our root folder. And instead of having these empty fragments wrap everything, we'll call in the sidebar wrapper. And then we'll add the closing tag as well and save that. And you'll see for now that only a bit of padding has been added, but once we add the other elements, you'll see the actual changes. Now, before we carry on with the layout, we need to create two important hooks which we'll be using throughout our application. So inside chat app, let's create a folder for the hooks. Let's create the first one, which is called use conversation.tsx, and the other one called use navigation.tsx. For the use conversation, we'll say export const use conversation, make it an arrow function. Now, what we want to do is in cases where we are on a conversation page where it's slash conversation slash ID, we want to get that ID and we want to know that we're on an active conversation. And the way we do that is we say const params is equal to use params, which is given to us by next navigation. And then we say const conversation ID is equal to use memo. And use memo is a way of creating a variable which only gets updated when certain other variables get updated. So you'll see that in a second. So we pass in an arrow function and we basically say assign to this the value of params, which could be undefined, dot conversation ID. And if it doesn't exist, just assign it an empty string and then assert that that's a string, so as string. Then we need to pass in a dependency array like we do in useEffect. And basically this says whenever params dot conversation ID gets updated, update the variable conversation ID as well. Then we also create another variable called const is active. And this keeps track of the fact whether we are currently on an active conversation or not. And to do that, we just take conversation ID and then we put two exclamation marks in front of it, which converts any type of value into a boolean true or false. So if there is a conversation ID defined, then this will be true, otherwise false. And then we say conversation ID in the dependency array. And then we return an object which says is active and conversation ID. So that's for that hook. Let's move on to use navigation. Now this hook will basically contain the configuration for the different paths we have in our application. So let's say export const use navigation is equal to arrow function again. Const path name is equal to use path name again from next navigation. Then we will create another variable called paths is equal to use memo. In this case, we'll be returning an array instead of any other variable. So let's just define the dependency array first, which will be path name. And then inside, the array is an array of objects where each object corresponds to a path that we have. So the name of the first path is conversations. The href is slash conversations. The icon is, and then we create an opening tag, message square. And then you see you can import it from Lucid React. So auto import that. And then that is just equal to path name dot starts slash conversations. And this is useful because when we're rendering the navbar on the left or the right, we want to know if it's the current active path name so we can render it differently with a blue color. And this will allow us to do that because whenever the user changes the URL, the path name will change and then the active will either be true or false for this object. So let's just copy that again and we'll create our second path, which is called friends. The href is also slash friends. The icon is users from Lucid React. And then for active, just check path name is equal to slash. But for conversations, we can either have slash conversations or slash conversations slash ID. And that's it for this hook. So we just return paths and we're done with that hook. Now we can actually begin working on creating the sidebar on the left-hand side for the desktop. To do that, we'll need two Shadcn components. Firstly is the card. So we'll just copy that and go into our terminal and run that. The other one is the tooltip. So in components, we'll find tooltip at the bottom and copy that as well and paste. And to make sure that the tooltip works, you need to go inside your main layout.tsx and just wrap your children a tooltip provider given to us by components/UI slash. And now we're ready to start working on the desktop nav. So inside the sidebar folder, we'll create another folder called nav, and we'll first create the desktop nav.tsx. Again, tsrafce. This doesn't really take in any props, so we can just delete those. This will be a client component, so we'll say use client, save that. Now we will need the current path, so we'll say const paths is equal to use navigation, which is the hook we just created. And since we are using a hook inside a component, that's why we need to define it as use client. Now the outermost element will be a card, and let's just write down nav for now. And just to see what we're creating, let's go back into the sidebar wrapper, and outside the main section we will add our nav item. So we'll say desktop nav over here, save that, and now you see a card with nav written inside it. So we'll go back into desktop nav, and we'll begin by writing the class name. So the thing is that we only want the desktop nav to be visible when the size of the screen is larger than LG, which is defined by Tailwind. So by default we want it to be hidden, but when the size is LG, then we want it to be flex. And what this will do is basically override the hidden styling and make it a flex, which will make it visible. We will say LG flex call, and in the case of LG, we want it to be justify between LG items center, LG H, LG W16, LG PX2, and LG PY4, and save that. And the reason we did LG for everything is because we'll have a separate mobile nav, and these are only the stylings for desktop nav, and we only want it to be there when the size is larger than LG. Now you'll see that nothing is visible right now, and that's because our screen is not wide enough. So what you can do is you can open the developer tools on whichever browser you are on, and by going to the top, you can specify the width to be 1250 by 200 by 500, and you can just zoom in top section of the page right now, which is where we'll be focusing, and just make that a bit bigger. Now, since we are rendering a nav bar, the child inside this will be a nav tag, and it will have another child, which will be a div. So everything in the nav will be rendered on the top, and everything inside the div will be at the bottom. So we'll give it a class name, flex, call, items, center, and gap. And inside here, we just want to render the user, which we saw from Clerk before. So if we go to the bottom now, we see that the user button is rendered there with the sign out and everything. So now we can work on the different navigation items that we have. So inside this nav over here, we will create an unordered list using UL. The class name will be flex call, items, center, and gap. Now what we want to do is add some logic in here. So we'll put in curly braces and we'll say path.map. And again, this is from the hook that we made. We will take the current path and the ID, and we'll say for each of these return an li, which is a list item. Give it a key equal to the ID, which is a requirement by React. The class name will be relative, and you'll see later why we need that. It's because we have an absolutely positioned element inside it. We want the href is equal to path.href, which we define inside the hook. Now we want each item to be wrapped with a tooltip so that when we hover over it, we see what this nav item goes to. We'll add a tooltip trigger. Again, get that from our local components. Get the button from our components. We want to specify that the button should have a size icon, and the variant is a property that's specified by Shadcn, and this will be based on the URL that we were fetching. The path is active, then just say the default styling, and if it's not active, make it an outline styling. And then inside we will render path.icon since that's already defined. And we can see based on our config inside use navigation, we already have the two buttons over here. All that's left is to go below the tooltip trigger and create the tool content, and it'll be a p tag, and just put the path over there and save that. So now we see that if we just close this and make the width a bit wider, we have the two different elements. We have the user button on the bottom. We have the conversations tab on the top with the conversations tooltip, and then friends on the bottom with the friends tooltip. And if we click on them, we see that the URL and the page also changes, and so does the styling of the button. So now let's go ahead and make this for the mobile view as well. So let's just copy everything, and then inside the nav folder, create mobile nav.tsx and paste that in here. And we'll just rename desktop nav to mobile nav, and then go back into our sidebar wrapper, and then on the top, just include the mobile nav as well. So the difference is that on the outer card, we want to remove all the styling, And you want to say that it's fixed to the bottom with a 4 padding. The width is equal to, and we'll be using square brackets over here for some custom width calc, 100% of the viewport width minus 32 pixels. This is just a way to make it work using the padding that we have. Flex, items, center, H16, P, and since we don't want it visible on larger screens on the desktop, we say LG, save that. And we already have the elements down here. So again, for the nav, we want the class name to be W. For the UL, we want to remove flex call and say justify evenly and remove the gap inside here. Everything else stays the same. But for the div over here, we want to move it inside the UL. We want to change the div into a list item as well. And we want to remove all the styling that it has. And there we have the mobile nav for narrower screens, and it works the same as the other one. So we can navigate between the pages and the user button for signing out or managing account. And if you switch to a larger screen, we see that it dynamically changes from the desktop nav to the mobile nav. Now we'll work on the items list, which shows up on the left-hand side, as well as a fallback for the conversations that shows up on the right-hand side. So let's just close everything, and inside chat app, components, shared, we'll create a folder called item-list, and we'll create a component called item list.tsx, tsrafce, and it will again be react.props with children. It'll take in two parameters additionally, which is the title, which will be a string, and an action, which will be react.react node. So this is basically the title which shows up on the top left of this container, and an action is the button which shows up on the top right. So inside here, let's destructure these props. So children, title, and action. And then we want to return a card again from our components folder. We'll give it a class name of h full, w full, lg flex none, lg w80, and a p of 2. And flex none just means that even though it's contained inside another flex box, its width is defined by the w80 over here. Inside that, we'll create a div, give it a class name of mb force for a margin on the bottom, flex, items, center, justify between, and below that will be another div, class name of w full, h full, flex call, items, center, justify start, and gap of 2. So the top div is for rendering the title and the button, and the bottom div is for rendering all the list items. So let's firstly render the title. So h1, give it a class name of text-2xl, font semi-bold, tracking tight, and render the title prop over here. And then below that, we want to check if there is an action specified, then render the action, otherwise render null. And what we want to do is we want to rename this action prop to capital action over here, just so we know that it's a component that's being rendered right here. And then inside this div, just render out the children and save that. So the first place it will be is at /friends. We want to render it out on the left hand side. So app root friends page.tsx, and replace this friends page text with item list and put the friends page inside that. And it needs a prop, which is the title. So we'll make that. And now we see we have this container over here with the title. No button yet, but we'll be adding that later. And it also renders out the children inside it. We also want it to be visible inside the conversations page. So we'll go into conversations and layout.tsx, and we'll firstly change these divs into fragments. And before this children over here, we'll create the item list, render conversations page, and put the title is equal to conversations. And there we go. We have the list of items on the left side of the friends and the conversations page. Now the right hand side is a bit empty, and both on the friends page and the conversations page, we want it to be just a fallback gray box with a warning. So again, inside the shared components folder, we'll create another folder called conversation, and we'll create two components, the conversation container.tsx and the conversation fallback.tsx. Let's define the conversation fallback first. So tsrafce, no props for this one. So we want to return a card. We want to give it a class name of hidden by default, but in large screens show flex. And that's because in narrow mobile screens, it won't be shown anyways because both the conversations and the friends page will take up the entire screen with using the item list. And if you're on a particular conversation, you don't want to see this anyways. So we will give it an H full and a W full. P2 items center, justify center as well. BG of secondary, which is given to us by Shadcn, and a text secondary foreground. And then inside here, we will say select slash start a conversation to get started and save that. Let's just copy all of this and then go into conversation container and rename the fallback to conversation container. This will have some props. So we'll say type props is equal to react dot props with children. And then we will get the children over here by destructuring. And then for the card, we'll just erase this class name over here. Instead of the text, we will render out children for now. And we'll say that the width should be full. The H, it'll be calculated. So H calc 100 SVH. And we're just saying SVH so that it works on iOS devices. Because later on, as a part of the course, we'll be learning how to make this into a progressive web app, which you can actually download onto your phone. And VH doesn't work on iOS, only SVH does. So we need to use that. And then minus 32 pixels. LG in LG H full for large screens. P of 2, flex, flex call, and gap of 2. And that's it for a conversation container. So we both have the conversation container for when a conversation is active and a fallback for when there is no active conversation. So obviously we want to render the fallback inside friends page.tsx. So we'll go over here and say conversation fallback and save that. And these divs again should be fragments and save that. And we see that we have the fallback rendered over here. We'll do the same thing inside the conversations page.tsx. So we'll remove all this and render conversation fallback. So we see even on the conversations page, we have that. But if we go to a particular ID, we don't have it because it's in the page.tsx and not in the layout.tsx. So to add what goes in over here for a particular conversation, we go into the conversation ID page.tsx. And instead of wrapping this with a div, we say conversation container and put that there as well. And now we have a nice div for when a particular conversation is active. And our entire input, list of messages, everything will go inside. Now an issue occurs in our mobile view. So let me just go to the home page and select a mobile view, for example, iPhone SE. So conversations page works properly. The friends page works properly. But if we go to conversations/1, we see that both the items list is being rendered out as well as the conversation page. But in mobile view, when we have a conversation active, the only thing we want to see is the current conversation page and no item list on the left hand side and no mobile nav on the bottom as well. So to fix this, we'll go back into the item list. And for the outermost card, instead of using a string, we want to use a function called cn, which is given to us by Shadcn. And what this can be used is to add some logic to the class names that we use. So let's go paste the string that we already had. And instead of it being visible by default, we want to add hidden by default. And now we can see that only the conversation page is on the mobile view. But the issue is that even in the wide view, the item list gets hidden now. So we need to add some logic for when we actually want the item list to be visible in the conversations pages. So to add some logic, after the string inside cn, we actually have an object and we can define where the key is a certain style or class name. And then we can define whether it should be true or false by using the value. So there are two cases in which we want the item list to be visible in the conversation section, either in mobile view when the conversation is not active, or in desktop view in either case if the conversation is active or not active. So to do that, we can say block, which is the styling which will be applied. And we want to apply this if a conversation is active. And for that, we need const is active and get that from use conversation. And then we'll say not is active. So if the screen is in mobile view and the conversation is inactive, then apply block, which will show the item list. Or when we are in a large screen, apply block if a conversation is active and save that. And again, since we are using a hook, we need to define this as a client component. Save that. So now we see everything is back to normal. We have the item list on the left and the conversations page on the right. And if we go to mobile view, we have just the conversations page and no item list. And then to fix the mobile nav appearing on the bottom, we want to go into mobile nav.tsx and again say const is active. Get that from use conversation. And in a mobile nav, this is the only nav that will be visible. So all we have to do is say if is active, then just return null. And there we see the entire conversation takes up the entire page. Don't worry, we'll be adding a back button later on. But for now, we have the mobile view for the conversation page, the mobile view for the conversations page, and the friends page. And then let's just make sure for the desktop version. So we have the friends page, conversations page, and then conversation page with a particular conversation with a container here for rendering out the conversation. So that's it for the layout. In the next section, we'll be adding a dark mode to our application. So now we'll be adding dark mode to our application. And since we are using Shadcn, it's surprisingly easy to do this. So Shadcn also provides us with documentation on how to do this for our Next.js project. So the first thing we need to do is install Next themes. So we'll go ahead and copy this over here and just run that. Next, what we have to do is create a theme provider component. So we'll just go inside the components folder inside UI and create a folder called theme. And we'll create a file called theme-provider.tsx. And inside there, we'll just paste what's given over here and save that. And next, we're told to wrap our root layout with the theme provider. So we'll go inside app and then the outermost layout.tsx. And then outside the convex client provider, we'll add the theme provider. And then we have to give it a few props. So we'll paste in the props as well and save that. And then the last thing we need to do is to add this toggle button, which will help us change between the different light and dark modes. So let's take a look at the code for that and just copy it. And then inside the theme folder, we'll create another file called theme-toggle.tsx and then paste the content over here. Now we see that the red lines mean that we don't have a component from Shadcn installed. So let's open up the menu over here and try to find the drop down menu, which is over here. And we can install that. So we'll paste that over here. Now all that's left to do now is to actually add this button and test out if we can change into dark mode. So to do that, we'll first open the desktop nav. And then on top of the user button, we'll just import the theme toggle. And we need to define the component over here. So instead of mode toggle, we'll call that theme toggle. And now we can auto import it. And we see that it's rendered over here. Before we use it, let's also try it out in the mobile nav. So in the bottom, before the user button li, we'll add another li and then add the theme toggle and save that. And now we can see that even in mobile view, if we go to a different page, we have a toggle button, which is like a drop down. So let's go back into the desktop mode and let's try it out. So let's change from light to dark. And then we see that everything changes to the dark mode and it's using the proper coloring. So there's a secondary color for this container and then a blue color for the button over here and the button over there. And also we can change it to system. So that'll change the color based on the user's settings on their machine. And let's go back into dark and we can see that it works in mobile view as well. So now that we're done with the layout, navigation, and then the dark mode, we'll get started with the friend requests in the next section. By the way, if you've been liking the video until now and you've learned something new, do consider subscribing to the YouTube channel. And in the comments down below, let me know any topic I should make a video on next. And also do consider joining the Code Complete Discord, where you can ask any doubts that you have, meet other developers like yourself, and also suggest ideas for new videos. So now we're ready to get started with the first actual full stack feature of our app, which is sending friend requests. So the way our application will work is that before you can start a conversation with anyone, you need to send them a friend request and they need to accept it. And to get started with that, we'll start with the backend side of things for requests. So the first thing you will need to do is to add a requests table in our database. So we'll open up the convex folder and go into schema.ts. And then we see we already have a users table. So after this comma, after that, we'll just create a new table called requests. And then we'll use the same define table function which we used before. And then our table will have two fields, which is firstly the sender, and the sender will be a v.id. So this is a special type which references an ID of another table. And in this case, we'll be referencing the ID of the users table. And then we'll have another field in this table called v.id, and that will be users as well. So we're basically creating a table where we'll store a mapping of the user ID who sent the request and the user ID who received the request. And again, to make searching along this table easier, we need to create indexes. So we'll say dot index. And the first one will be by underscore receiver. and then the field we'll pass in for that is the receiver field. So the index will be called by receiver, and it's mapping to the receiver field which we have. And we'll also need to index by receiver underscore sender. And in this case, we need to pass in both the receiver and the sender to be able to get the data. So you'll see why we need this later, but we need both of these indexes to be able to search along this table. So now that we have the schema defined, we need to create the actual API endpoints, which the front end can call. So again, the naming convention is that you take the table name, and if you're doing a operation on a single request, we will call that in the request.ts file. And if we are doing an operation on multiple requests, such as getting all the requests for a certain user, we'll do that in requests.ts. So for now, we just want to be able to create a single request. So we'll go into the Convex folder and create request.ts and save that. And then what we'll do is we'll say export const create, which will be the function the front end will call. And we'll create a mutation, which we will fetch from Convex. The first field will be args, which is the arguments passed to it by the front end. And we will take in the email, and that will be of type v, which we import from Convex dot string. And then the next field inside this dictionary is the handler. So that will be an async function, which will take in the context and the args that we have, and we'll create an arrow function. So what the front end will do is send us an email to which we want to send the friend request. And inside here, we'll create a request inside our table. And then the person who's receiving the request can fetch the request that they have, and then render that on the front end. So the first thing we want to do is we want to get the identity of the current user who is sending the request, who's calling this create function. So we'd say const identity, and then we'll say await ctx dot auth dot get user identity. And since we had that integration between Clerk and Convex, this works out of the box. So we need to add a check if not identity, which means there is no current logged in user calling this. We'll just say throw new convex error, and we'll pass in the message unauthorized. But if this error doesn't happen, then we'll check if args.email is equal to identity.email. This basically means that the user tried to send themselves a request. So we'll create a new error, convex error, and we'll say can't send a request to yourself. Now this identity that we have is basically the object that's returned to us by Clerk. But if you remember, we did a mapping of Clerk users to our own users stored inside our Convex database. And whenever we're creating a request, we want to reference the Convex user instead of the Clerk user. So what we'll have to do is create a helper function. So we'll create another file called underscore utils.ts. And the underscore utils basically means that it won't contain any convex functions. So the front end can't really call these functions inside here directly. Over here, we'll create a function called export const get user by Clerk ID export, and that will be an async function. It will take in the CTX and the Clerk ID, and of course we need to add in the types for that. So we say colon, and then CTX will be either query CTX or mutation CTX, and we need to import these. So we'll go to the top and say import query CTX and also mutation CTX, and just remove this curly brace over here. And then of course this needs to be an arrow function, and then we'll define the type of Clerk ID, which will just be a string. And then inside here, what we want to do is return await, take the ctx.db.query the users table, and then we use the with index function, and we use the by Clerk ID index that we made. We take in the query and we say q.equal, and we want to match the Clerk ID field to the Clerk ID we are being passed in the function. And then since we want to get just one, we say dot unique. And that's our helper function, and we'll be using this throughout our app. So we'll go back into request.ts, and we'll say const current user is equal to await get user by Clerk ID. We'll pass in the CTX, and we'll pass in the Clerk ID, which is equal to identity dot subject. Then we'll check if not current user. Then we'll throw a new convex error, and we'll say user not found. Then we will get the receiver's identity. So we'll say const receiver is equal to await ctx.db.query. We'll query the users table again, and we'll say dot with index by email, which we just defined. We'll get the query, and we'll say q.equal, and the email field should be equal to args.email, and then we'll say dot unique. So basically we're getting the email for which this function is being called, and then using that we're getting the user which should receive this request. And then again we'll add a check if not receiver, throw new convex user could not be found. Then we check const request already sent, because we don't want to be able to send multiple requests if they already exist. So await ctx.db.query requests, which we just made. And then we say with index, and we use the by receiver underscore sender index, and we say q dot equal, the receiver should be equal to receiver dot id, and then we can change a dot equal, because keep in mind our index is based on two fields, and this should be underscore id. And then in the second equal, it should be sender, and that should be equal to current user dot underscore id. And then we'll say if request already sent, throw new convex error, request already sent. And then the last check which we want to do is const request already received is equal to await ctx.db.query. And what we can do is we can just copy the query which we did for request already sent. And all we want to do is replace current user and receiver. So we'll say current user for the first place and receiver for the second place, and save that. And if request already received, it should be D, then what we want to do is throw new convex error and say this user has already sent you a request. It should be D again. So after all of these checks have been complete, we finally know that we can send a request. So we'll say const request is equal to await ctx.db.insert. We'll insert into the requests table, and then the data we want to insert is the sender, which is current user dot id underscore id, and the receiver is receiver dot underscore id, and save that. And then lastly, we just return the request that we have made. So that's the backend, and now we'll get started with the front. So let's close all the backend files and get started with the front end for sending requests. So the first thing we need to do is create a dialog which shows up and where you can enter the email of the people you want to send requests to. And since this will only be on the friends page, we will go into app, root, friends, and create another folder underscore components. And if you remember, underscore means that this won't be included in any URLs. And in there, we'll create a file called add friend dialog.tsx. Now we'll need to add a few things from Shadcn before we can continue. So we'll say npx shadcn-ui at latest add form, which is the first component, dialog, and input, and run that. Once that's done, we'll do tsrafce inside the file we just made. Now the dialog which we'll be making will be including a form where the user can include inputs. And usually when you're adding an input on the front end, it's nice to have some validation, such as the length of the input, and if it's an email, you want to check it's an email before the user submits. And for that, we'll be using something called Zod, which is a validation library already included with the form component, which we downloaded in Shadcn. So to use Zod, what you need to do is you need to define the schema of the form. So we'll say const add friend form schema, and that will be equal to z dot object. And we also want to import the resolver, so zod resolver from add hook form slash resolver slash zod. Now we can continue with our schema. So what we're defining is the schema of the form that we'll have, so z dot object, and in here we'll define the different fields inside our form. So the only field we'll actually have is the email, and we want to add some rules for what this field can contain. So we'll say that the email field should be z dot string. So we only want to accept strings over here. We want to add a minimum length and say that it should be a minimum length of 1. And if this doesn't happen, we want to show the user a message which says this field can't be empty. And then lastly, we want to add a dot email, since this is an email field, and we want to say please enter a valid email in case the user does not input an email in this place. So we have defined the schema of our form. Now we can go inside our component, and we'll be using another library to maintain the state of our form. And this hooks up really nicely to Zod. So whenever the user tries to input something and it doesn't meet the validation, this hook that we're going to use will automatically show an error and won't allow the user to submit. So we'll say const form is equal to use form, and you can see we're importing that from React hook form. We want to define the type for it, so we'll say z.infer and type of, and we'll pass in the add friend form schema. So this is basically telling use form that use the schema from Zod that we've supplied you with. And then inside the parentheses, we want to say the resolver should be the Zod resolver, and then we'll pass in the schema. So this is saying that whenever somebody tries to submit the form, check if the form meets the criteria of the schema which we just made. And then we'll define some default values, and that'll be for email, and it'll just be an empty string. Now let's create the actual dialog which gets rendered on the front end. And before we do that, we want to see it. So we'll go into page.tsx of the friends page, and then we'll say for the item list, the action should be equal to the add friend dialog, and just close that. And of course, we want it to be a client component. So we'll go into add friend dialog and we'll say use client on. And you can see the text is being rendered out of our dialog component. So we'll delete everything over here. And the outermost element will be dialog, which we import from our components folder. The first item will be a tooltip. The tooltip trigger will be inside that. And the trigger for our tooltip will be a button. For the button, the size will be equal to icon, and the variant will be equal to outline. And the button will also be a dialog trigger. So when we click on this button, it'll open up the dialog. So we'll say dialog trigger. And inside here, we want to render out the user plus icon from Lucid React and save that. And now we can see a button on top over here. Let's just switch to the light mode and we can see it there as well. Below the tooltip trigger, let's add the tooltip content from our components folder. And it'll just be a p tag that says add friend. So now if we remove the mobile mode and we hover over this, we see that the add friend tooltip shows up back into the mobile mode. So that's it for the tooltip. Below that, we want to add the dialog content. So dialog content. First, we have the dialog header, and the first child inside that will be the dialog title, and that will say add friend, and save that. And we see that if we click on the button now, that the title shows up. Below the title, we want to add a description. So dialog description. We'll say send a request to connect with your friends. And we see the description shows up as well. So we're done with the header. Now we add the actual content. So we will use a form component, and that will be given to us by our components folder. And then we want to just destructure form, which we created on top over here. Inside here, the child will be a form tag, which is just a regular HTML tag. We'll define the on submit and set that equal to form.handle submit. So this handle submit function is given to us by React hook form. And inside this, we actually have to pass the function which gets run whenever we want to handle the submit function. So we'll create a handle submit function later on. Right now, we'll just pass in this name. And let's just add a class name of space dash y dash a. So we just space everything out inside our form. Let's create a form field. So it'll contain a control prop, and we'll just say form.control. So this hands over the control of this field to our form hook. The name of this will be equal to email because that's the only field we have inside Zord. And then the render function will take in a parameter of field, and it'll be an arrow function. And we want to return a form item. It'll have a form label of email. And then next to the form label, it'll have a form control. And then inside that, it'll have an input given to us by our components. And we just want to say that the placeholder should be email dot dot dot, and then pass in the rest of the field variable as destructured. And of course, we don't have this handle submit function, so let's just make an empty function for now. Const handle submit is equal to an arrow function that's empty. And we'll open up that dialog. And now we see we have an input with the label. Below the form control, we also want to render out the form message. So nothing will be rendered out right now, but behind the scenes, Shadcn will look at this field that we have, and if there are any errors for that, as verified by Zord, it'll render them out below. And this should be a self-closing tag actually. Below this form field, we'll add our dialog footer. We'll have a button, which will just say send, and then disabled. We'll just set this to false right now, and we'll change it later on. And then we'll say the type is equal to submit, and this should be send, and save that. And that's it for the front end side of things. Now we need to actually call the backend request, which we had made for creating a request. And before we do that, we'll create a useful hook inside our hooks folder, which will let us add some state to any mutation which we call. So we'll create a use mutation state.tsx file, and we'll say export const use mutation state, and we'll say mutation to run can be any. And we'll create a stateful variable called pending, and set pending is equal to use state, and we'll set that to initially false. And what this hook is basically allowing us to do is to call any mutation on the backend, which will either create a request or a conversation, etc. And it will allow us to get a pending state so that we can either disable or enable a button while the request is running. And we'll say const mutation fn is equal to use mutation, and we get that from Convex, and we just pass in the mutation to run into that. So whoever calls this hook will tell us which mutation we have to run. We'll call the use mutation hook from Convex so that we're actually able to run that mutation. And then what we'll create a function called const mutate is equal to pass in a payload of type any. And when we create, and before we start the backend request, we'll say set pending is equal to true. We'll say return mutation fn, pass in the payload, and then in the dot then we'll get the res and return the res. We'll create a dot catch error, throw error, and this should be inside curly brackets. And then in the dot finally, we'll say set pending equal to false. So before the request is run, pending will be set to true. Then we'll run the request. If it passes, we'll pass whatever gets returned to us by the backend. If there's an error, we'll throw the error. And in either case, we'll just set pending to false once the request is complete. And then in the end, we'll just return from this hook the mutate function and the pending variable. So now we'll see how this actually works so that it makes more sense. So we'll go back into add friend dialog. And then at the top, we'll say const mutate and pending is equal to use mutation state. And we will pass in API, which we import from our convex folder, dot request, which is the file that we made earlier on, and then we call the create function. Now this returns to us the pending variable and the mutate function, which we just made using the hook. And we want to rename the mutate function to create request so that it just makes more sense in this context. Now inside the handle submit function, we actually want to call this create request function whenever we submit our form. So we'll say is equal to async, since this will be creating a request to the backend. We'll take in the values as a parameter, and it'll be z.infer type of, and infer the type of add friend form schema. So it's basically saying we'll take in the values from the form, and this helps us define what the values type is. Inside here, we'll say await and then create request, which we define on the top. We'll pass in the email, which will be equal to values.email. And again, all of this value stuff is being handled by the use form hook, so we don't need to worry about where it's coming from. In the dot then, we'll say form.reset so that everything inside the form is emptied out again, like the input. And then we want to run dot catch as well, and then take in the error. Now, whenever we make a backend request, it's usually a good idea to tell the user whether the request was successful or not. And we usually show that using a toast, which shows up on the bottom right. And thankfully, Shadcn has a feature for that. So we need to go into the terminal and write npx shadcn-ui at latest add sonar. This will install everything we need to show toasts. To make sure that the toasts show up to the user, we go into layout.tsx. And below the tooltip provider, we will add a toaster component, and we'll import that from our components folder. Make sure not to import it from Sono directly. And we will pass in a prop called rich colors, which basically ensures that we see red and green based on the context of the toast. Go back into add friend dialog. And then in case the request is successful, we will say toast, import that from Sonar dot success, and we can say friend request sent. And in case there is an error, we will say toast.error. Now, there can be multiple types of errors, but some of them we've defined in our backend in the cases that we were checking. So we can say error.instance of convex error and import that from convex. If it is a type of convex error, then what we can do is just render out error.data. Otherwise, we can say unexpected error occurred and save that. And error.data will basically contain the messages which we had made. So if we go back into convex and request.ts, we threw all these convex errors. So that will be inside the error.data that's returned to us. So let's save that. And again, whenever we click on the submit on the send button, or if we click enter, the on submit will get run. It'll call form.handleSubmit, which will call the handle submit function which we just made. And then it'll verify everything. And if everything is verified, it'll make a backend request. And based on that, we'll be able to send a request or not. Now, before we try to test it, let's go into our server and just restart it to make sure our toast function works properly, and refresh. And while we're at it, we'll remove the props since this component doesn't take any props. Save that. Now we'll open up our friend request dialog, and let's just try to send a request without entering anything in the email. And we see that Zod verifies everything, and it shows that this field can't be empty message based on the verification we had. Let's try to enter some random text and try to send. And it already shows the please enter a valid email message. So let's say at gmail.com. And keep in mind this email does not exist in our database. And we click send. We see this error which says user could not be found, which is being sent to us by the backend. So now let's try to send it to a user which actually exists inside our application. So code complete.test2 at gmail.com, and we'll send. And we see that we get an error message and we should not. So let's go back here and check what's wrong. And what's wrong is that we did not use a dot unique at the end. So we just want a single request in each case. So let's just add the dot unique at the ends over here. And we'll see that the function is actually being updated to the Convex cloud as we save. So once it's done saving, let's try to run that again and click on send, and it says friend request sent. And now if we check our Convex database, this request should be there. So we see in Convex we have two tables now, a requests table, and we see that we've created a new request over here. Now if we send a request to the same user again, it should ideally show us an error, and it does, saying request already sent. And if we log in as the user who actually got the request and we try to send a request to the user who just sent us the request and send, it shows an error which says this user has already sent you a request. And lastly, if we try to send ourselves a request, again, we get an error that says we can't send a request to ourselves. So now that we're able to send a request to another user, let's actually try to render out all of the requests that have been sent to us, and then we'll be able to accept them. So to be able to render the list of requests that a user has received, we need to create the backend function for that first. And again, since we'll be returning multiple requests, not a single one, we'll create another file over here inside a convex folder called requests plural.tsx. We'll create a function export const get is equal to query, which we get from our server folder. We won't really have any args. And then the second field will be a handler, which will be an async function, which takes in the context and the args as before. We'll again get const identity is equal to await ctx.auth.get user identity. We'll say if not identity, throw new error unauthorized. We'll get the current user by saying const current user is equal to await get user by clerk ID, and we'll pass in the ctx, and the clerk ID is equal to identity dot subject. We'll be doing this for every request we make in the backend where we get the identity and then we get the current user from our convex database. And we also check if not current user, then we say throw new convex error and say user not found. And of course we import convex error. If both pass, we say const requests is equal to await ctx.db.query from the requests table, and we'll say dot with index. We want to use the by receiver index, and we want to say q dot equal the receiver field should be equal to current user dot id. And then we'll use dot collect because we want to get more than one item, so this will return an array. So again, we're querying on the requests table by using the by receiver index, and we're saying that the receiver should be equal to the current user's ID because we want to get the requests sent to the current user. And we use dot collect, so we get all of them. Now, this won't contain all the details of the request. We also want to get the sender's details, such as their avatar and their name, so we can render that. So we'll say const requests with sender is equal to await promise.all. And what promise.all does is that we pass in an array of multiple async requests, and it runs all of them together in parallel, and it returns an array of their results back to us. So inside here, we'll say requests.map. We'll get the request at the current index, and this will be an async function, and use an arrow function, and we'll say const sender is equal to await ctx.db.get request.sender. So what we're doing here is we're going through all of the requests that we just got for the current user, and we're getting the sender. And this get function is a pretty general function in Convex where we can pass in an ID of any object in any table, and it gets us that object. We'll check if there is no sender, then we say throw new convex error request sender could not be found. Otherwise, we say return, and then we return the sender as well as the request details. And then in the end, all we have to do is say return requests with sender and save that. So that's it for the backend. Now we actually have to call this function and render it out in the front end. So we'll go into friends page.tsx, and on the top we'll say const requests is equal to use query from convex. And since we are using a hook now, we have to declare this as use client. Inside the use query function, we call API, which is from our convex folder, dot requests multiple, which we just made, and then the get function. Now, the great thing about convex is that this requests variable will be called when the component loads, but behind the scenes, convex will also maintain a webhook, and it will actively update this variable when anything in the backend changes, which should fetch this function again. So if somebody sends the user another request, this variable will update automatically without us needing to do anything. So now what we do is inside the item list, instead of friends page, we add curly braces and we say requests. If the requests does exist, we render null for now. If it doesn't exist, we say loader2, which we get from Lucid React, and we just say class name h8w8 and save that. And you saw for a second that there was a loader and then we render null. Now, in case the requests does exist, we want to check, does the requests.length is equal to 0? If it is, we want to render a p tag and we want to say no friend requests found. And then we add a class name to this p tag, which says w full h full flex items center justify center. And that's basically centering this entire p tag. But in case the length is not equal to null, it means that we actually want to render something. So we'll add a colon and we will say requests.map get the current request and return a request component which we haven't made yet and save that. We will pass in a few values. The key will be equal to request.request.underscore id. The id is equal to the same thing, so request.request.id. We will pass in image URL, which will be equal to request.sender.image URL, username, which will be equal to request.sender.username, and then email, which will be equal to request.sender.email, and save that. And again, all of these fields are possible because they're being sent to us by our backend, where we combine both the request details and the details of the user who sent the request. To render this, we will go inside our components folder here and we'll create a request.tsx and we'll do tsrafce. And over here, we'll just import that using the auto import back here. For the props, we'll say the ID should be equal to ID, which we can get from convex. And by using the angle braces, we'll say it should be equal to an ID of requests table, and TypeScript will take care of that for us. The image URL should be a string, the username should be a string, and the email should also be a string. And now we see there's no errors inside the page. Over here, instead of props, let's get the ID, image, URL, username, and email. And let's just shift to the user who was actually sent the request. So we'll delete this, and the outside will be a card. We'll give it a class name of w-full p2 flex row items center justify between and gap of 2. Inside the first child will be a div of class name flex items center gap 4 and truncate. And truncate basically helps reduce any words that will be longer than the div down to triple dots. Now inside here, we actually want to render the image of the user. And for that, we'll install another Shadcn component, which will be called avatar. Now we can go in here and say avatar and get that from our components folder. The avatar image, which we will get, should be self-closing and have an src is equal to image URL. And then in case it can't be fetched, we will say avatar fallback. And inside here, we will render the user icon from Lucid React and save that. And now we can see actually see the avatar of the user who sent the request. Below this avatar, we will create a div with a class name of .flex and .flex-call and .truncate. And this is a tip for using VS Code where you can define the element and then using dot, you can chain them to define the class names. And when you hit enter, they'll automatically be added to the class name field. For the H4, we'll create it with a class name of truncate again. And inside we'll pass in the username and save that. And you see it's being rendered over there. And then below that, we'll do a p tag with text-xs, text-muted-foreground, and .truncate. And there should be a space between these two. And then inside this, we'll enter the email of this user. And we see that being rendered out. Now we want to give the option of either submitting or denying this request. So after this div, we'll create another div. We'll give it a class name of flex items center and gap 2. The first will be a button given to us by our components folder. The size will be equal to icon. On click, we'll just have an empty function for now. And inside, we'll render the check icon from Lucid React. Let's just copy this. And over here, we want to say the variant should be equal to destructive. And then instead of check, we want to render X from Lucid React. And we want to say class name H-4 W-4. and save. And my bad, this div should be outside this other div. And we see that it's equally spaced out now, and we have two buttons rendering out the requests that the current user has. Now, whenever a user has requests, we actually want to let them know that they have some requests by showing a badge in the navbar over here, which shows the number of requests. So to do that, we'll go back into the requests.tsx backend file, and below the get function, we'll create another function called export const count is equal to query, and args will be nothing, and the handler will be async ctx args, and we'll just copy the initial first few steps, so this identity stuff, current user stuff, and we'll go ahead and paste that over here. And we can do that for the request we make as well. So const requests, we'll copy that from the top and we'll paste that over here. And then what we do is we just return requests dot length. Now, if you'll remember, the entire configuration for the navbar is done using the use navigation hook. So let's just go ahead and open that. And we can just query this count function inside this hook. So what we'll do is go down here and say const requests count is equal to use query, and we'll say API dot requests dot count. And then for the friends path, we will just say that the count variable should be equal to requests count, and we will just add that to the dependency array after path name and save that. Now to render this, let's go into our nav component, so desktop nav, and we actually need to install another component from Shadcn, which will be the badge component. Now what we'll do is go before this tooltip trigger curly braces, and we'll say path dot count. So if the count does not exist, then just render null. But if there is a count, then we will render a badge given to us by our badge folder. Inside that, we'll render path.count, and then we'll give it a class name of absolute, left 6, bottom 7, and px2. And now if we open up the desktop view, we see that the number is being rendered out over there. We also want it inside the mobile view, and it's not there right now. So we'll go into the mobile nav component and we'll do the same thing. So before the tooltip trigger, we'll say path.count. If not, then just null. If yes, badge from our components folder, class name absolute left 7, bottom 6, and render the path.count and save. And we see that it's being rendered there. So now we'll add the ability to deny a request by clicking on this X button. So we'll go into request.ts over here, and let's just copy this create function and paste it again. And we'll just delete this args.email check over here, and then everything below the current user check. Then what we want to do is get the current request. So is equal to await ctx.db.get args.id, and we actually need to change the args that we have. So the ID will be equal to v.id of the table requests. And this function should also be called deny. So after we get the request, we say if not request or request.receiver is not equal to current user.id. So if whoever sent this request is trying to deny a request that they didn't receive, we say throw new convex error. We say there was an error denying this request. And then what we do is just say await ctx.db.delete request.id, and that'll just remove the request from our database. Now to actually call this, we will go into our request component over here, and on the top we'll say const mutate and rename that to deny request, and pending equal to deny pending is equal to use mutation state and api.request.deny, and we import this API variable and save that. And this reminds me, in the add friend dialog, we never use this pending, so we copy this pending variable, and in the disabled of the send button we write pending. So whenever a backend request is made, this button will be disabled so the user can't keep clicking the button and keep sending the request. Let's go back into the request component. Now what we can do is go to the buttons that we had, and for this first button we can say disabled is equal to deny pending, because for both accept and deny we want it to be disabled while a request is going on in the backend. So we'll copy that for the other component as well, save that. And then in the on click, we want to call deny request, pass in the ID of the current request, and then say dot then. If it's successful, then do toast dot success friend request denied. But if there is an error, so dot catch, then take in the error and first check toast.error, error instance of convex error. If it is, then the toast should say error.data, otherwise unexpected error occurred. So now we're ready to deny this request. So let's just refresh and let's click on the X button over here and we see friend request denied, and you'll see that automatically this component updated, and since we don't have any more requests, it shows as empty. So we'll just go ahead and send another request to this user for the next part where we'll be allowing the user to accept a request. So now we'll be adding the functionality to accept a request. And this step is important because based on this, we'll be creating a bunch of different entities inside our backend, such as a friendship, a conversation, conversation members, and the messages list. So to define those, let's just go inside our convex folder and into schema.ts. And let's just define all the other tables which we'll have in our backend. So we'll have another friends table in our backend and we'll use define table. And what this will do is contain user1, which will be v.id of users, and user2, which will be v.id of users again. And what this will do is basically contain a list of active friendships between different users once they've accepted a friend request. And for each friendship, we will also be having an active conversation. So we'll say conversation ID, and that will be equal to v.id of conversations. Now we don't have this table defined yet, but we will soon. And then let's add the indexes. So dot index by underscore user one, and then we pass in user one. Just copy this and by underscore user two, and then again by underscore conversation ID, and then use the conversation ID, and this should be user two. So that's our friends table. Next, we have our conversations table. So define table. This will have a field of name. It'll be an optional field. So we'll say v.optional and v.string. We'll say is group. So this will decide whether it's a group conversation or not. And then last message ID, which is v.optional and v.id of messages. So since a conversation could have no messages, it's optional. But in case it does, this will keep track of the last message that was sent. We don't have any indexes for this. So next we'll have conversation members and define table. And what this table will do is basically keep a track of a mapping between users and the conversations that they're a part of. So the first field will be the member ID. So for each, so it's a many to many mapping between conversations and users. So for each mapping, we'll have a member ID. So that's the v.id of users. We'll have the conversation ID that this member is a part of. So that'll be v.id and conversations. And then we will have last seen message, because each user for each conversation, they will have the message that they've seen last. So that'll be v.optional and again v.id of messages. And then we will say dot index by underscore member ID, and we pass in member ID. Copy this and paste it again, and we will say by underscore conversation ID, and we will use conversation ID over here. And then lastly, we want to do a combination of by underscore member ID underscore conversation ID. And since it's multiple, we will add a comma here and we will say conversation ID as well. So we have 3 indexes for this table. And the last table for now is messages. So we'll say define table, sender ID. So that's the person who sent this message, v.id users. We have the conversation ID. So the conversation to which this message was sent, v.id conversations. We have type, which is v.string. So this could be a message of type text, or it could be an image or a file. So we just keep track of that using the type variable over here. And then the content, which will be the content that's sent inside. So instead of being a string, this will be v.array of v.string. And this is basically because the user could send multiple files or multiple images as a part of their message. And we'll keep a track of that as an array of strings. So even if they send a normal message, that'll be an array of one string. And then lastly, we add dot index by underscore conversation ID, and we pass in the conversation ID and save that. So that's it for our database schemas for now. So now that the schema is made for now, we will create the mutation for accepting a request. So we'll go into request.ts. Before we create the request, we want to add another check where we want to say const friends1 is equal to await ctx.db.query the friends table, and say dot with index by underscore user1 q q.equal user1 and current user.id dot collect. So we're getting all of the friends of the current user who is creating this request, and friends2 by underscore user2 and user2. So what we're doing is we're getting all of the friendships where the current user is the first friend and all of the friendships where the current user is the second friend. And we'll just check in either of those cases if the other friend is the user that is getting this request. So friends1.sum friend.user2 is equal to receiver.id, or friends2.sum friend.user1 is equal to receiver.id. And then inside here, if the friendship already exists, which is basically what this is checking, we'll say throw new convex error. You are already friends with this user. So as a recap, what we're doing is we're getting all of the friendships in which the current user is the first friend, and we're checking if the second user in these friendships is equal to the receiver. And we're also doing the opposite, where the current user is the second friend and the receiver is the first friend. And what this if case basically checks is that if there is already a friendship between the two users, and if there is, we don't want to send another request, so we add this check. So now that that's out of the way, we can create another mutation for creating a new friendship and accepting a request. So we say const, so we say export const accept is equal to mutation, args is equal to id v.id of requests, and then the handler is of type async. We take in the ctx and args, and then we do what we did before where we check the identity and the current user. So let's just copy that. And then we say const request is equal to await ctx.db.get args.id. And then we check if no request or request dot receiver not equal to current user.id, then throw new convex error that says there was an error accepting this request. Otherwise, we create a new conversation. So we say const conversation ID is equal to await ctx.db.insert. And over here, we've begun creating a new friendship and the conversations related to it. So we insert into the conversations table, and we say that the is group should be false because this is a private conversation between two users. So we made the conversation. Now await ctx.db.insert friends user1 current user.id user2 request.sender, and then the conversation ID which we just made. And you begin to see here that even though a friendship is two-way, the current user can only be in either one of the two fields. And that's why we had to do that double check when creating a new request. So we made the friendship. Now let's create the conversation member. So await ctx.db.insert. And what we're doing here is basically linking the users with this conversation which we just made. So inside conversations member, let's add member ID, current user.id, and then conversation ID. We'll just pass that in. And a small mistake over here. This should not be this should be just users. And now that error is gone. And we do the same thing because we have two members in this conversation. We do that for request.sender as well. So now both of these users are a part of this conversation. And then the last thing we do is await ctx.db.delete request.id. Save that. And now let's add this to the front end. So we will open up request.tsx. And the same way we did the deny request, we will do the accept one. So accept request and accept pending. And this will be the accept function. For the buttons, we will say that disable should either be deny pending or accept pending for both. And we'll just copy the on request content over here into the accept one. And this will be accept request. We'll pass in the ID. The message for success should say accepted, and the rest should remain the same. So let's save that and just refresh. Again, the request is being rendered out over here, and let's click on the accept button. We see friend request accepted, and now let's check our database for the tables and the new data. So now the requests table is empty, but we see we have a bunch of other tables. So messages will of course be empty since we haven't made any. Friends, so it has one object inside it which maps the friendship of the two users which we just accepted. A conversations one where we have a single conversation which is not group, and then we have conversation members where the conversation ID is the same, but it's the two members that have just become friends. So that's it for friend requests and how to create them, list them, accept and deny them. Next up, we'll be getting started with the conversations and how to send messages and to view the messages. By the way, if you've been liking the video until now and you like learning new things by creating your own projects, I highly recommend checking out this service called Code Crafters, which is a company backed by Y Combinator, and it allows you to become a better engineer by working on projects such as Redis, Git, and Docker and making them completely from scratch using your own two hands in any language you like. So if we take a look at their catalog, they have a bunch of different projects such as Git, Redis, creating your own BitTorrent and Docker, and even your own SQLite. And you'll also see that they have a bunch of languages which you can do all of these projects in. So you can choose your language of liking and get started. And the best part is that you can start off for free, and there is a paid membership which you can become a part of to view more advanced content. But Codecrafters has been nice enough to provide Code Complete with a special discount of 40% on all memberships. So if you check out the link in the description down below, you can get started with Codecrafters with a 40% discount. So if you like learning by creating your own projects, definitely check it out. So we saw that whenever we add a new friend, we also create a new conversation. So the first step is to render out the list of conversations on the conversations page. And the first step is that is to create the backend request. So in the convex folder, we'll create another file called conversations.tsx. And we'll just go into the requests.tsx and copy the get function from here and paste that here. Now we need to import some stuff such as the query and get user by clerk ID and convex error. After this current user check, we can basically delete everything. So let's just go ahead and delete all of that. And we'll say const conversation memberships. Because to get the conversations for a particular user, we need to get the memberships that they have. We'll say await ctx.db.query and we'll query conversation members and we'll say dot with index and the index we'll use is by underscore member ID and we'll say q dot equal member ID and that should be equal to current user dot ID. And since we want to get multiple of these, we'll say dot collect. So we're getting all of the conversation memberships of the current user. And then we'll say const conversations and we'll use promise dot all. And what we want to do is go through conversation memberships and we want to dot map through them. And since conversation memberships can be empty or null, we'll just use a question mark here. And we'll say for each of these elements, do an async function where we get the membership. And what we first do is get the conversation based on this membership. So we say await ctx.db.get membership.conversation ID. Because keep in mind, the membership is a mapping between the user to the conversation. So this is present inside the conversation memberships object. Then we say if not conversation, throw new convex error, conversation could not be found. And then in the end, return conversation. After that, since we want to render it out on the left-hand side, we need some other details like the user who's associated with it and their name, their username and stuff like that. So we'll go down here and say const conversations with details is equal to await promise.all. And inside here, we want to do conversations.map. And for each element, it'll be an async function. We'll get the current conversation as well as the index we are at. And this should have been an await on the top. For each, we will say const all conversation memberships. So we're getting all the memberships belonging to this conversation. We'll say await ctx.db.query conversation memberships. And now we want to get all the members for this conversation. So we'll say const conversation memberships is equal to await ctx.db.query conversation members. We want to do with index and by conversation ID q dot equal conversation ID and conversation question.id. So we are getting all of the memberships belonging to the current conversation. And of course, we want to do dot collect on that. Then we say if conversation dot is group. For now, we'll just return an object with the conversation inside it. Else, otherwise, in case it's a private conversation, we want to get the other user. Yeah, so we want to get the other user. So we'll say const other membership is equal to all conversation memberships dot filter, get the membership. And we want to filter out our current user. So we'll say membership dot member ID not equal to current user dot ID. And again, the reason we're doing this is because we want to render the other members' profile picture on this list. So we need to get their details. Then we'll get the other member. So const other member is equal to await ctx.db.get other membership dot member ID, and this should be the first element in here since this will return an array in the filter. And finally, we'll return the conversation as well as the other member. So as a recap of what we're doing, this function is supposed to get all of the conversations that the user is a member of. So firstly, we get the current user. We get all of the memberships that the current user has. Based on that, we can get all of the conversations that the current user is a part of. And then we need to add particular details to this data so that we can render stuff on the left-hand side, such as the name of the conversation or the profile picture of the other user. So firstly, for each conversation, we get all of the other members inside the conversation. If it's a group, we just return the conversation data without adding anything else. But if it's not a group, we get the other member in this conversation, which is not the current user, by using this filter function. Then we get the details from the database, and then we add their details to the data that we return. So now that we made the backend function for this, let's go into the front end and create a component for this. So inside app, root, conversations, let's create an underscore components folder, and then we'll create a component called dm conversation item.tsx. And this is because a group conversation item being rendered here will be different from a direct message conversation item. So tsrafce as always. And in the props, we'll take in an ID, which will be equal to ID from convex of type conversations, image URL, which will be a string, and then username, which will be a string. And let's just destructure that over here. So ID, image, URL, and username. Save that. Before we begin creating this component, let's just render it out inside our layout.tsx. So firstly, we define this as use client. Then before we return, we say const conversations is equal to use query API. We import that from conversations.get. So this is the function we just made. And then we'll change the content of the items list. So let's add curly braces and add some logic inside here. So firstly, we want to check if conversations exists or if it's undefined. If it is existing, we say null. Otherwise, we say loader2. So we show a loading icon. And if we refresh, we see a loading icon. So now let's deal with the case in which it exists. We also want to check conversations.length is equal to 0. Let's just render null and null for now. And one more thing, in the backend function which we made at the bottom, we want to return this conversations with details. We'll save that. We'll go back into our layout.tsx. In the case that the length of the conversations is 0, we'll render out a p tag, give it a class name of w full, h full, flex, items center, justify center. And inside the p tag, we'll just render no conversations found and save. In case the conversation's length is not equal to 0, we want to do conversations.map, get the current conversation, and inside the arrow function, we want to return conversation.conversation.isGroup. So if it is a group, for now we'll return null because we haven't made the component for that, but otherwise we'll return dm conversation item. So the key should be equal to conversation.conversation.id. The ID should be the same, so conversation.conversation.id. We have the username, which is equal to conversation.othermember.username. And since this is an optional field, we will render a empty string if it doesn't exist. And then we will say image URL is equal to conversation.othermember.image URL, and otherwise an empty string. So now let's go ahead and create this component. So the outermost element will be a link pointing to this conversation. So we will use next link. The href will be using string interpolation. So slash conversations slash ID, and class name is equal to w dash full. Inside here, we will have a card, class name p-2, flex row, items center, gap 4, and truncate. Then we'll have a div inside here, which will have a class name of flex row, items center, gap 4, and truncate as well. Inside, we will render the avatar. The avatar image will be the first child, and src will be equal to image URL from our props. Then we will have avatar fallback, and inside here we'll just render the user icon from Lucid. And we can see we already have a conversation rendered over here. After the avatar, we will create another div with a class name of flex call, and truncate. Inside here we will have an h4 with class name truncate, and inside here we'll render the username, and we see the username being rendered out now. And below that we'll have a p tag, and a class name with text-sm, text-muted-foreground, and truncate again. And inside, we'll just write start the conversation for now. In case there are any messages in this conversation, that should show here instead. But for now, we just have this as a default. And let's just check out the mobile case. So it's responsive right now. If we start decreasing the width, we see that it works in the mobile case as well. And then since it is a link, if we click on it, it takes us to slash conversations slash the conversation ID for this particular conversation. So now that we can render stuff in the items list, let's add some stuff to the actual conversations page, such as the header, the body, and then the chat input at the bottom. So the first thing we need to be able to render the current conversation is the details of the current conversation. So luckily we have the conversation ID in the URL, so we'll be using that. So let's go inside our convex folder and create a conversation.ts. This is different from the conversations.ts we made. Again, we'll go into requests.tsx and just copy the query that we made and go into conversation.ts and paste that. So the first change is that in the args. So the first thing we'll do is just import everything. So query get user by clerk ID and convex error. In the args, we actually want to take in the ID, which is v.id, which is v.id of type conversations. For the handler, we'll do everything with the current user. I'll just go ahead and delete the other stuff which is not needed. Then we'll say const conversation is equal to await ctx.db.get args.id. And this should get the conversation that's passed to us. Let me check if not conversation, throw new convex error, conversation not found. Now again, since we're rendering the current conversation, we'll basically want to get the details of every single member of this conversation. So first we'll say const membership is equal to await ctx.db dot query, and we query the conversation members table, and we say dot with index by underscore member ID underscore conversation ID. Then we'll take the queue and we say queue dot equal the member ID should be equal to current user dot ID, and then we chain another dot equal onto that since it's a complex index, and we'll say the conversation ID should be equal to conversation dot underscore ID and then dot unique. We will then check if the membership exists. If it doesn't, that means that the user isn't a part of this conversation. So we'll say new convex error, you aren't a member of this conversation. So that's just a check that we're doing. Now we want to get the details of all the other members inside this conversation. So we'll say const all conversation memberships is equal to await ctx.db.query conversation members dot with index by underscore conversation ID, and we say q dot equal conversation ID and args dot ID, and then we say dot collect. So we're getting all the memberships belonging to this conversation. And then right now we just care about the not group case. So we'll just say if not conversation dot is group, we will get the other membership, so the other user belonging to this private conversation, all conversation memberships dot filter. And as we did before, we'll say membership arrow function membership dot member ID not equal to current user dot ID. And then we'll get the other members details. So const other member details is equal to await ctx.db.get other membership dot member ID. And this is showing a red because this should be the 0th element in this array. And then after this, we'll just return dot 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 conversation. So this includes all the conversation details. We will include the other members details. So we will include other member details. And then we would also include the last seen message ID, which is equal to other membership dot last seen message. And this will just help out with read receipts, which we'll add later on. And then we will say other members is equal to null. We're not using this in the not group case, but this will be there for group chats. And we just want a consistent type return from the backend. So we're just keeping this as null. And then we'll save all of this. Now let's increase the size of the sidebar here. And then now inside the conversation ID folder, we want to include some components. So we'll create an underscore components folder. We'll make a header.tsx component. We'll create a body folder inside here, and we'll create a body.tsx. Back in the components folder, we'll create an input folder and then a chat input.tsx component. And now we can begin writing down what all these components contain. So let's start with header.tsx, tsrafe, and reduce the size of the sidebar again. This will take in two props, the image URL, which will be an optional string, and then the name, which will be a string as well. Let's just destructure that. So image URL and name. Then for this div, we'll render a card. For the class name, we'll keep w-full flex rounded -lg items center p-2 justify dash between. Inside the card, we have a div. We give it a class name of flex items center and gap of 2. The first element is a link from next link. Class name is block, and for large screens will be hidden. And what we want to do here is render circle arrow left. And this is basically because in mobile screens we want the conversation to render across the entire page, so we need a back button to navigate back to the conversations page. Of course, this needs an href, so href is equal to /conversations, and we save that. And before we carry on, let's just create some placeholder components. So inside chat input tsrafce, and same for body. And let's just add it to the conversation ID page. So in the conversation page, firstly we'll say const conversation is equal to use query, and that should be equal to api dot conversation dot get, and the ID should be equal to conversation ID. And the way we get that is from the params of this page. So let's delete the props variable here, and instead it will have a field called params, and from that we can take out the conversation ID. And on the top here for the type of props, we'll say it has a field called params, and then the conversation ID is equal to ID from convex and conversations. So what's happening is that once this page renders, you'll see that we have a conversation ID in the URL, and Next.js automatically gives this to us using the params prop, so we can remove the conversation ID. And since we're using a hook now, we say use client on top. Now we can render the conversation. So we'll remove the return over here. And the first thing we'll check is conversation is equal to undefined. If it is, then we render a div, give it a class name of w full h full flex items center and justify center. And then inside we show a loader 2 from Lucid and give it a class name of h8w8. If it's not undefined, then we check if it's equal to null. So if it is null, that means this conversation does not exist. So we show a p tag with the same class name as the top. So we'll just copy this. And inside here, we'll just say conversation not found. But if it's not undefined and not null, then we have our final case where we render out the conversation container as before. The first thing we do is render out the header, which we just made. Then we render out the body, and then we render out the chat input. Now the header takes in a few props. So the image URL is equal to, we check conversation.isGroup. If it is a group, then the image will be undefined for now. Otherwise, it will be conversation.otherMember.image URL. And then the other field is the name. So again, we check conversation.isGroup. Then we just render conversation.name, because when we're creating a group, we actually define the name for the conversation. But if we're not, we just use the other user's name. So we say conversation.otherMember.username. And then since all of this is optional, we also render out an optional empty string if neither of these are defined. Back into header.tsx, below this link and the circle arrow left, we render out an avatar, class name h8w8, avatar image. The src is equal to the image URL, which we're getting from the props. And then the avatar fallback, give it a class is name.substring, and then we just get the first letter of the name. So for cases of groups, we'll just render out the first letter of the group name. We'll save that. And we already see the header is being rendered out. And then below this avatar, we'll just create an h2. The class name is font-semi-bold. And inside, we will render the name of the group. And in this case, it's the other user that we're talking to. So that's the header. Let's add some stuff for the body. So the outermost div will have a class name of flex-1 so that it takes up the most space, w-full flex overflow-y-scroll flex call reverse, because this will help render out the messages in reverse order, because we'll be getting them in reverse order, gap-2 p-3 and no-scroll bar. Now this no scroll bar thing is not from Tailwind, it's a custom class that we need to add. just so that in the main body, no scroll bar gets rendered once the messages are there. So we'll go into globals.css and we'll go to the bottom and we'll create at layer utilities. And for Chrome, Opera, and Safari, we say .no dash scroll bar dash webkit dash scroll bar. We'll give it a styling of display none. And then for Edge, Firefox, and Internet Explorer, we'll say no dash scroll bar and we'll say dash ms dash overflow dash style of none and scroll bar width of none as well. So you won't see this right now, but you'll see that no scroll bar is being rendered out later on once we have a few messages. And for the chat input, we similarly just want to create a placeholder for now. So we'll create a card. Inside that, we'll say chat input. And then for the card, we'll give it a class name of w-full, p-2, rounded-lg, and relative. And now we're able to render out the current active conversation. So now let's add the ability to actually type out the messages and then send them to the other user. So before we get started with the front end, let's make the back end for creating a message and sending it. So we'll go into the Convex folder and create another file called message.ts. Over here, we'll say export const create is equal to mutation. And then the args will be conversation ID, which will be of type V, which we import from convex dot ID, and it will be the ID of conversations. Then the type of the message, such as string or such as text or file or image, which will be v dot string, and then content, which will again be a v dot array of v dot string. Next, we have the handler, which is an async function taking in a ctx and args. And again, we have to do that entire thing with identity and current user. So let's just go into conversation.ts and let's copy this stuff over here and go back to message.ts and just paste that in. And of course, we have to import them and save that. Now, before we send a message, we have to make sure that the user is a member of this conversation. So we say const membership is equal to await ctx.db.query. We query the conversation members. Then we use the with index and we use the by underscore member ID underscore conversation ID index. Then we take in the queue and we say queue dot equal, and then we say that the member ID should be equal to current user dot ID, and then we chain another equal and we say that the conversation ID should be equal to args dot conversation ID, and we want to get a unique membership, so we just say dot unique. And then after that, we check if not membership, so no membership is found, we say throw new convex error, and we say you aren't a member of this conversation. Next, if the user is a member, we create the new message. So we say const message is equal to await ctx.db.insert. We insert into the messages table, and the data we insert contains the sender ID, which is equal to current user.id. And then the rest of the stuff is being sent to this function. So we just use the spread operator and spread the args in there. And then whenever you send a message, we want to update the last message ID for the conversation. So we say await ctx.db.patch. Patch means update a certain data. So we say args.conversation ID, which is the object we want to update. And then we say the last message ID is equal to the message. So we create the message, and then what we do here is tell Convex that find the conversation with the given conversation ID and update the last message ID equal to the message value, which is the ID of the message that was just created. And then we will return message. So that's for the backend. Before we get started with the front end of the chat input, we need to install another dependency. So we say npm install react text area dash auto size. And what this dependency does is it allows us to create a text area which automatically resizes based on the input, which is not usually possible using the default text area given to us by HTML. So let's go into chat input. And since this is an input where the user can type, as before we did with the dialog, we will need to create a schema for this form so that we can validate the input. So we say const chat message schema is equal to z, which we import from zod dot object. Then we say that we have a field called content, which is z dot string, and then we have a dot min of 1. And if the size is less than 1, we give a message which says this field can't be. Save that. We can just delete the props field because we won't be taking in any props for now. So firstly, let's just define this as a client component because we'll be using a bunch of hooks here. So use client. The first thing we want to do is we want to get the current conversation ID. So we say const conversation ID, And if you remember, we had a use conversation hook, which will give us the conversation ID from the URL if it exists. Then let's just define the mutation which we just made. So let's say const mutate is create message, and then the pending variable is equal to use mutation state. We pass in API dot message dot create. After that, let's use the use form hook to create the form. So const form is equal to use form. We have to define the type. So we say z.infer, so telling Zord to infer the types. And then we say the type of should be equal to chat message schema. So this is just telling the use form hook that it'll be of the same type as the schema we've defined over here. Then in here, we pass in two properties, the resolver, which is Zord resolver, and we pass in the chat message schema. And then we have to define the default values, and we just have the content, which will be empty by default. Let's also create the handle submit function. So const handle submit is equal to async. We take in the values from the form. So we do z.infer and then the type of chat message schema as we did on top. It's an arrow function. We do create message, which we have just called from the use mutation state. We pass in the values of conversation ID. The type will be of text since we are sending the data right from the input. And then the content, if you remember, it has to be an array. And then inside we will put values.content, which is the value which we've defined inside our form. So after the create message, we do a dot then. We do a form.reset to just empty out everything inside our form. And we also do, and then in the dot catch, we take in the error. And as we've done before, we do a toast dot error, but we check error instance of convex error. If it is, then we show error dot data. Otherwise, we show expected error occurred. And just delete these braces over here. Now, another thing we want to do is whenever the data has been sent, we also want to focus back into the input, because what will currently happen is that the focus will be lost from the input that we have over here. So we'll go to the top and we'll say const text area ref is equal to use ref from React. It'll be of type HTML text area element or null, and then the initial value will be null. And what we'll do is we'll basically attach this to the text area that we will be adding later on, and this will get attached to it. And whenever we submit the data to the backend, this will be used to focus back on the input once the data has been submitted. So those are the functions that we need for now. Let's actually add some stuff inside the markup. So the first child inside here will be a div. Let's give it a class name of flex gap dash 2 items end and w dash full. In that, we will be adding the form from our components folder and just pass in dot 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 form that we've defined on top. Inside that, we'll create another form component. Just remove this action stuff. For the on submit, we will say form dot handle submit and then call the handle submit that we have defined. Let's add some class names. So flex gap of 2 items dash end and w dash full. Save that. Now the child inside here will be a form field. For control, we'll just say it's equal to form.control. For name, it will be equal to content because that's the only field that we have. And then for render, we will take in a field parameter from the object that's being passed to us. And we'll say return a form item. Give it a class name of h full w full. We have to add a form control inside that. And inside that, we will import something called text area auto size, and it's self-closing, and it's not being auto imported. So we'll go to the top and we'll just import text area auto size from react dash text area dash auto size. Now we'll add some configuration for this component that we've imported. So we want the rows equal to 1 by default. We want max rows equal to 3. So we'll start with 1 row, and if the text is longer, it'll go up to 3 rows, after which we will get a scroll bar. We will pass in the rest of the parameters from the field object that we get. For the on change, we will be using handle input change function, and same for on click, we'll be using handle input change function. And the reason we need to do this, and we didn't need to do it earlier, is because earlier we were using a basic HTML element, but text area auto size isn't a basic HTML element, so we need to define our own function for what happens when the input changes. And also we'll be adding stuff like an emoji selector later on, so we will need to add some logic to our onChange function. So which is why we define it over here. Let's also create a placeholder and we'll say type a message. Let's add the class name, and this will be a bit long. We'll say min h full, w full, resize dash none. We want the border to be 0, outline to be 0, bg should be equal to the card value given to us by Shadcn, text dash card dash foreground. The placeholder should be text muted foreground. And then we want a p of 1.5. And as we did before, below the form control, we add the form message. Now let's quickly define this handle input change function on top. So we'll say const handle input change. It takes an event of type any. We get the const value and selection start from event.target. And we say if selection start not equal to null, form dot set value, set the value of the content field equal to the value. So we're getting the value and the place of the cursor inside the input, and as long as it's not equal to null, we update the value inside our form using the value that we got. And before this form item, we just add a return. And another thing we need to do is whenever the user clicks on the enter button, we want to automatically send the message. So inside this text area auto size, another field we'll add is on key down. And we want to make it an async function which takes in the event. And we want to check if e.key is equal to enter and not e.shift key. So basically, if the user clicks on shift enter, they want to go to the next line, but if they click on just enter, they want to submit. So if that's the case, we do e.prevent default, which is a common thing you need to do inside forms. And then we say await form.handle submit and then call the handle submit function. And what this does is it returns us another function. So we need to call it again using the parentheses, and we save that. And now we see we have an input over here where we can define what we want to write. And then if we go more than 3 rows, it creates a scroll bar. Now all we need is a button to actually submit this. So we will go to the bottom over here, and this form field should actually be self-closing. And then inside the form, the next element will be a button. Disable will be equal to pending because we don't want the user to submit multiple messages while the previous one is pending. The size will be equal to icon. Type will be equal to submit. And then we want to show send horizontal and save that. And there we have our component for creating messages and then sending them. So let's just type a message and send it. Now, of course, we didn't add any toast over here because it would be annoying to see a toast every time you send a message, but we can check if the message was created in the backend. So let's open up Convex and let's open up the messages table. And over here, we see that the message with hi there has been created, and we have the different elements and we have the different columns also populated. Let's just check if the ID has been updated for this conversation as the last sent message. So it's just JS77. Let's go into conversations. And as we see, the last message ID is also JS77. So we now have message sending working properly. Now all we need to do is render out the messages for the users to see. So to render the messages in the body, the first thing we need to do is fetch them from the backend. So we'll open up the Convex folder again and create a file called messages.ts. I'll just go into conversations.ts and then copy the get function from there since we'll be using a lot of the functions there. And I'll just delete the part that's below the current user section. So all up until the return part, I'll just delete that. If you want, you can abstract all of this into a function. I just chose not to do it for this tutorial. So we'll say const messages is equal to await ctx.db.query, and we query the messages table, and we say dot with index, and we do the by conversation ID, and we just take the queue and we say queue dot equal. The conversation ID should be equal to args dot ID, and we just need to change the args as well. So the argument we take is ID, and that's a v dot ID of type conversations. The data we get, we want to order it by descending, and by default, Convex uses the creation date as the value for ordering. So we're doing it in descending order of creation date, and then we do dot collect so that we get all of the values. Then we want to get the data about the user who also sent the message. So we have to do const messages with users. And you should probably know by now that we have to use promise.all since we'll be parsing all of these details. So we'll do messages.map async message since we'll be fetching some data in here. And we'll say const message sender is equal to await ctx.db.get message.sender ID. If there is no message sender, then we'll throw new convex error. We'll say could not find sender of message. And another thing we want to do before this is ensure that the user is a member of this conversation. So we'll go into message.ts and we'll copy the membership code that we had, go back and just paste it before we fetch the messages. And this should be args.id. And there we have that. And if the message sender does exist, then we return an object which has the message, but it also has the sender image, which is equal to message sender.image URL. It has the sender name, which is message sender dot username, and it has is current user, which will be message sender dot id is equal to current user dot id. And this is just a boolean which will help us render out the message either on the right hand side or the left hand side. And then at the end we just say return messages with users. So now that we have that defined, let's go into the body component that we had made and actually include the fetching of this data. So on top we will say use client, and then we need to get the conversation ID. So we'll say const conversation ID, and of course use the use conversation hook. And then we need to fetch the messages. So we'll say const messages is equal to use query from convex, and we'll import api.messages.get, and we'll say that the ID should be equal to conversation ID as we import ID from the data model. We import ID from data model, and we say it should be of type conversations, and save that. Now we'll create another component inside this folder called message.tsx, and we'll do tsrafce, and this will take in a few props. So from current user, which will be boolean, sender image, which will be string, sender name, which will be string, last by user, which will be boolean, because if it's the last message in a group of messages that the user has sent, then it'll have a different styling. The content will obviously be an array of strings as we've defined it inside our schema. Created at will be our number, and then the type will be a string. And then we can extract all of these. So we say from current user, sender image, sender name, last by user, content, created at, and type. Now we can go back into body.tsx and actually send all of this data to the message component. So we'll delete this chat body over here, and we'll say messages.map, and then at each position we will get an object as well as the index. The object we will destructure into getting the message, the sender image, the sender name, and is current user. And what we'll do is we will create an arrow function, and this should be sender name. And in here we will first check const last by user is equal to, so what we're doing here is checking if the user has sent consecutive messages, if this is the last message in that consecutive order, and if the next message is by the other user, because this will change how we draw the border of the last message. So we check messages of index -1 dot message dot sender ID is equal to messages index dot message dot sender ID, and then we do a return, and we return the message component that we just made. Save that, and of course we need to pass in all the props. So we say key is equal to message dot ID, the from current user is equal to is current user, sender image is equal to sender image, sender name is equal to sender name, last by user is equal to last by user, content is equal to message dot content, created at is equal to message dot creation time, and then type is equal to message dot type. And since the messages index -1 can be optional, we will add the optional question mark over here. And now everything works properly, so let's render out this data. Before we do that, we need to install a library. We'll say npm install date-fns, and this will help us render out the time at which the message was sent. So the first thing we'll do is create a function called const format time is equal to get the timestamp, which will be a number, create an arrow function, and we'll return format, which we get on the top. So we'll say import format from date-fns, and then we just want to format this timestamp number into the form hh:/mm. Save that. Now let's delete what we're returning right now. Let's create a div, give it a class name. Now we want some logic inside this class name, so we use the cn function inside our utils, and something that will always be there is flex and items-end, but we also want a conditional styling of justify-end, and we want this to be added when from current user is true. And this basically decides if the message is on the left or the right. So inside this div, we'll create another div, and that will also have a class name which has some logic inside it. Use the cn function, always pass in flex call, w full, and mx2. And then for the object, we want order dash one and items dash end for from current user. And we want order dash two and items dash start if not from current user. And again, this is a part of styling the message so that it appears on the left hand side or the right hand side. Inside, we create another div, class name. Again, we'll be using some logic, so cn. Always give them a px of 4, py of 2, rounded dash lg, and max width, and it's a custom value, so square brackets and 70%. For the object, we will say give it bg dash primary and text primary foreground, and do this if it's from current user. Otherwise, give it bg dash secondary and text secondary foreground in case it's not from current user. Then we say rounded dash br dash none in case it's not the last message by the user in the group and it's from current user. So since we're rendering the current user's messages on the right hand side, and if this is the last message in a group sent by the user, we want the bottom right border to be none. But in case it's the other user, rounded BL will be none. And then we can just copy this and just add a not from current user that. Now let's render the actual content. So we will add type is equal to text. We'll be adding a bunch of other cases later on, but for now we just have text messages. And then we add a p tag. If not, we'll just render null. Inside the p tag, we want to add the class name of text dash wrap, break dash words, white space pre-wrap. And this just helps with the wrapping of the message in narrower screens. And inside here, we will render message. And inside here, we will just render out the content and save. And now we see that the message that we send is actually being rendered out. So another thing we need to do is render at the time at which the message was sent. So p tag, class name, and again, we will be using some logic. So cn text dash xs flex w dash full my dash 1. Now an object. So we'll say text primary foreground and justify end. This should occur when it's from the current user. Otherwise, text secondary foreground and justify dash start if it's not from current user. So this just decides the alignment of the date to the left or the right based on who the user is who sent it. We will call the format time function and we will pass in the created at value. And there we see the date of the created at is being sent as well. So before the outermost div, we will now need to render the avatar of the user who sent this data. So we say avatar, class name, and again, some logic. It'll always be relative, w-8, h-8. And then with some logic, we will say order dash 2 if it's from current user, order dash 1 if it's not from current user, and then invisible if it's last by user. Inside, we will add an avatar image from our components folder. The src will be equal to sender image. And then for the avatar fallback, we want to render out sender name dot substring and then get the first one by typing in 0, 1. And now we can see that the avatar of the user who sent this message is being sent out. And now we can render all the messages in a conversation. So let's put them side by side and see the real-time nature of the messages. So on the left, we can see that if you're not the current user who sent this message, you'll see it on the left-hand side and gray. So let's just send another message saying, hey, how's it going? And send that. And we see that it's updated live both on the left-hand side and the right-hand side. And let's send another message saying, I'm doing well. And we see that the styling is slightly different from both, where the border is none for the last one on the right hand side and the left hand side in case it's the other user. So now that we can send messages and render them, we actually want to add the data over here in the conversations list where we can see the last message that was sent in this conversation. So to get the details of the last sent message for a conversation, we'll open up conversations.tsx, which is in our backend. And we'll just create an internal function for now. This won't be exposed to the front end. So we'll just say const get last message details is equal to async. And notice we're not using query or mutation. So this is just a normal function. It'll take in ctx and id, and they will be of type ctx, which is query ctx or mutation ctx. and we need to import that. So we'll say import query CTX and auto import that and mutation CTX. And then the ID will be of type ID, and there should be a semicolon. It will be of type ID of messages, and we need to import ID from /_ data model as well. And then we will make an arrow function out of this, and this parentheses should be over here. So first we check if not ID, return null, and this ID is actually the message ID. So we'll basically be sending the message ID of the last sent message to this function, and it will send the details of that message. We'll say const message is equal to await ctx.db.get ID. If not message, just return null. Const sender is equal to await, and we'll get the sender details. So ctx.db.get, and we'll get the message.sender ID. If no sender, then return null yet again. We'll say const content is equal to get message content, which is a function we'll make in a bit. So we'll send the message dot type and message dot content as unknown as string. And then lastly, we just return content, and then sender will be sender dot username. Now let's create this get message content function. So const get message content is equal to, we take in the type, which is a string, and content, which is also a string, and we create a switch case of the type. So the only case we have for now is text. So if the message is of a text type, then we just return the content. Otherwise, for default, we return a text which says non-text. So again, we can have messages of multiple types, such as text or image or file, and all of those will have different logic for what the content should be. But for now, we just have text, so we just straight up return the content. So let's save that. Now we need to actually use the function that we just made, which is get last message details. So let's open up the get query that we had before, and we will just go to this part where we are checking if conversation.isGroup, and we will say const last message is equal to await, and we will use the function we made. We will pass in the ctx, and then ID will be args.conversation ID, and then ID will be equal to conversation dot last message ID. And one thing we missed is that inside the function definition, the ID can also be undefined. So we're getting the last message, and then in both cases, if is group, then return the last message. And even if it isn't a group, just return the last message. Now we'll open up DM conversation item because that's where we want to render this data. In the props that we'll be taking, let's take in last message sender, which will be optional and string, and last message content, which will be optional and string. And let's accept them here. So last message content and last message sender, we should have an A. So we'll go to this section where we are creating this p tag, and we'll wrap it with curly braces because we want this to be conditional. So if there is a last message sender and there is a last message content, then we want to render something else. We want to render a span, give it a class name of text-sm, text muted foreground, flex, truncate, overflow ellipsis. Inside here, we will add a p tag, class name is equal to font dash semi-bold. We will render the last message sender. We will render a semicolon. And then to add some space, we will write and NBSP and then semicolon. We'll create another p tag with class name truncate overflow dash ellipsis, and we will render the last message content. And that's it for the markup over here. Now let's actually pass in those two props from layout.tsx. So we'll go into layout.tsx, and then the last message content and last message sender will need to be passed in, which will be equal to conversation dot last message dot content and conversation dot last message dot sender, and save that. And now we see that instead of start the conversation, we see this text where the last message sender's name is written as well as the text that they sent. So now that we are able to start a conversation and converse with friends, we now have to add the ability to remove friends from the top right in the conversation. So to create the ability to remove someone as a friend, we first want to make the backend for it as always. So inside the convex folder, we will create a new friend.ts function, and then we'll just go into message.ts, and I'll just copy everything and paste it into friend.ts. And then everything after the current user section, I'll just delete. So everything until the return part. We will take in just one param, which is the conversation ID. And then we will first check if the conversation exists. So const conversation is equal to await ctx.db.get args.conversation ID. if not conversation, then we want to throw an error, throw new convex error, and we want to say conversation not found. And the reason we're taking the conversation ID instead of the friend ID, because on the front end, all we have is the conversation ID available to us. And also whenever we remove a friend, we want to delete the messages as well. And we can use the conversation ID index to delete all of them. So after the conversation has been found, we'll say const memberships is equal to await ctx.db.query, the conversation members table. And then we want to do dot with index, and we want to do by conversation ID. We would take the queue and we say queue dot equal, we say conversation ID, and that should be equal to args dot conversation ID. And then we do dot collect because we want to collect all the members of this conversation. And we first check if not memberships or memberships dot length not equal to 2. We want to say throw new convex error. This conversation does not have any members. And keep in mind, we want to check for equal to 2. It's because we can only remove friends from a private conversation, not a group conversation. Then we get the friendship. So const friendships is equal to await ctx.db.query friends dot with index. We query the by conversation ID and we do queue, return queue dot equal. The conversation ID should be equal to args dot conversation ID again. And then we just do a dot collect, and we just do a dot unique because friendship should just exist singularly for each conversation, and this should be singular as well. So we check if not friendship, then we say throw new convex error, and we say friend could not be found. So now that we have the friendship, now we can actually begin deleting stuff. So to do that, we'll first get the messages in the conversation. We do await ctx.db.query the messages, and we say with index. We use the by conversation ID index. Again, queue dot equal the conversation ID equal to args dot conversation ID, and then dot collect. We will first delete the conversation. So we'll say await ctx dot db dot delete, and we just pass in the ID. So args dot conversation ID. Await ctx dot db dot delete. We want to delete the friendship. So friendship dot underscore ID. We want to delete all the memberships. So we'll say await promise dot all. We'll go through the memberships. We'll say dot all, and we'll say dot map async membership arrow function await ctx.db.delete membership.id. And then let's just copy that. And we want to do the same thing to the messages. So messages.map, get the message, and then do message.id to delete that. And there we have the mutation for deleting friendship. Now let's get started with the front end. Firstly, we need to show the option of deleting a friend. So we'll say header.tsx. We want to update the props. So we will also take in an options prop, which is optional. It will be an array of objects, and the arrays will have a label field, which will be a string, a destructive field, which will be Boolean, and an onClick function, which will take in nothing and return void. And then let's take in the options. And then below the h2 and the div where we render the name, we will create a new div with the class name of flex and gap-2. Inside here, we will check if options exist. If not, null. But if they do, we render a drop-down menu from our components folder. The drop-down menu trigger will be button, size of icon, and the variant will be secondary. And inside the button, we need to set the logo. So that'll be the settings logo from Lucid React. And of course, we aren't sending any options right now, so nothing is being rendered. But let's just add the markup, and then we'll send the props. And so then we'll have the drop down content. We do options.map. We get the current option and the current index, and we say return drop down menu item. Inside we pass option.label, and then we have a few props. So the key will be equal to ID, on click is equal to option.onClick, class name is equal to, and then we have some logic. So CN, we always wanted to have font dash semi-bold, and then we wanted to have text dash destructive if destructive is true. So option.destructive and save. So to see this, we'll actually go inside page.tsx for this. And let's just define the options. So we'll say options is equal to, and then we check conversation dot is group. If it is, we'll pass in something, otherwise another array. Now inside these options, we'll be controlling a bunch of different dialogues which will open up whenever the user clicks on them. So let's just add the stateful variables for those, which we can use later on. So we'll say firstly const remove friend dialog open and set remove friend dialog open. and we'll say that equal to use state, and that'll start with false. I'll just copy that again, and then the next one is delete group dialog. So we'll just say delete group dialog open and set delete group dialog open. Another one is for leaving the group, so leave group dialog open and set leave group dialog open. And then lastly will be a call type, so call type and then set call type. So in the additional content in the paid version of this course, we will actually be adding audio and video calls, and that's where we'll be using this stateful variable. And then in that, types will either be audio, video, or just null, and that should be in the types over here, and we'll just start that off with null. So those are all the stateful variables. Now we can create the different options that we have. So in case of group, we will have the first option as label of leave group. Destructive is false, and on click we just want to say set leave group dialog open to true. So that's the first option. Let's just copy that again. The second one is delete group. Destructive will be true for this one, and we want to say set delete group dialog open to true. And then if in case it's not a group, just a private chat, we just want to say remove friend. Destructive is true, and on click should be set remove friend dialog open to true. Now we see we have a gear icon over here, and it shows us the option of remove friend. Clicking it doesn't really do anything right now because we don't have the dialog. So we'll go ahead and create that now. So we want to say npx shadcnui at latest add alert dialog. Now inside this components folder here, let's create another folder for dialogs, and let's create remove friend dialog tsx and do tsrafce, and it will take in a few props, conversation id of id, and that will be conversations. We'll have open, which will be boolean, and we'll have set open, which will be dispatch. We take that from React. Set state action, we again take that from React, and boolean. So this is basically means it's a set state function. In the props, we'll destructure that. So we'll take the conversation ID, take the open, and take the set open. On the top, let's just add the use client before we begin, and we'll say const mutate remove friend and pending is equal to use mutation state api dot friend dot remove, which we just made in the backend. And we have to change the name of the function, which I don't think we did. So we'll go into friend.ts and just rename that to remove. Let's go back into remove friend dialog. Let's create a function const handle remove friend. That'll be an async function. We will call remove friend with the conversation ID. We'll do a dot then, and if it's successful, we will say toast dot success removed friend. Otherwise, we'll do dot catch, take the error, toast dot error, error instance of convex error, and if it's true, we show error dot data. Otherwise, we show unexpected error occurred, and this should be data, and save that. So we have all the functions we need. Now let's change the markup. So the first thing we have is an alert dialog. The open value will be equal to open, which we get from props, and on open change is equal to set open. Alert, the child that we have is alert dialog content, and the first thing in that is the alert dialog header. We add the alert dialog title, and this just says are you sure. So before we carry on, let's just try to render this out so we know what we're doing. So inside page.tsx, inside the conversation container, we'll just call remove friend dialog. The conversation ID is equal to conversation ID. The open is remove friend dialog open, and set open is set remove friend dialog open. Now let's go back, and then let's click on the remove friend button, and now we see the dialog. Below the alert dialog title, we have the alert dialog description, and we will just add some warning text. So this action cannot be undone. All messages will be deleted, and you will not be able to message this user. All group chats will still work as normal, and save that. And we see we have the description as well. Now outside the header, let's add the alert dialog footer. We will say alert dialog cancel, and that'll just say cancel, and then we have a disabled for that, and that's equal to pending, so you can't cancel after you've sent a request to continue. And then we have alert dialog action, and again that'll be disabled if it's equal to pending. Otherwise, we will say delete inside it, and for the on click, we will call handle remove friend, and save that. So let's just click on cancel, refresh again. We'll go inside the conversations page and see that we do have one item over here. Let's go into the conversation and click on remove friend. Let's just do cancel, and now we'll try to actually delete the friend. and this should say delete. And now if we click on it, we see this error page that shows up, and that's because the conversation has been deleted, but we're still on the same page. And Next.js gives us a useful way, and Next.js gives us a nice way of handling the situation. So since we are inside the conversation ID folder and we have nothing to render out for the page.tsx, we have a special file name called error.tsx, which gets rendered out whenever there's an error. And for that, what we can do is say use client. We say export default function error, taking the error object as a prop, and error is equal to error from next/error, and error is equal to error. In here, we will get the router is equal to use router from next navigation. We'll create a use effect, and we will say router.push and to/conversations. And this will get updated whenever error or router are updated. And we will just return the conversation fallback. So what this basically does is that if we go to the conversations/ID page and there is no conversation to render because the backend isn't sending anything, then we will just render out the conversation fallback temporarily, and then the router will send us back to the conversations page. So let's save that, and we see that we're still going to the conversations ID page. An error happened, and then we were redirected back to the conversations page. So it's also pretty useful if the user just enters a random ID. We can't find a conversation, so we get sent back to the conversations page. So that's it for conversations and removing friends as well. In the next section, we'll get started with creating groups and sending messages in. So now we'll get started with group chats, and the first thing we need to do is to be able to create a group. And to get started with that, we first need to see which all friends the current user has so that they can add them to the group. And to get started with that, we'll get started with the backend. So we'll open up the Convex folder and create a file called friends.ts. And we'll just copy the get function that we have and go back into friends.ts and paste that. Again, we import query, get user by clerk ID, and convex error. And then we'll just go ahead and delete everything until the return statement. So what we want to do is get all the friends belonging to the current user. So we'll get all the friendships in which the current user is user number one. So const friendships1 is equal to await ctx.db dot query. We'll query the friends table, and we'll say dot with index by underscore user one, and we'll take q and say q dot equals user one, and that should be equal to current user dot id. And then we do dot collect, and we'll do the same thing, but we want the current user to be user two. So friendships user two, and then user two should be equal to current user dot id. And then we'll just combine the two. So we'll say const friendships is equal to dot 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 friendships one and dot 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 friendships two. So what this is doing is it's basically creating a new array with the elements of both of them. Then we'll get the details of these users. So const friends is equal to await promise dot all friendships dot map get an async function friendship, and we'll say const friend is equal to await ctx.db.get friendship dot user one is equal to current user dot id. If the user one is the current user, then we want to get user two, so we'll say friendship dot user two. Otherwise, we want to get friendship dot user one. Then we'll check if there is no friend, then throw new convex error, and we'll say friend could not be found. Otherwise, we'll just return friend. And then we'll go to the bottom and we'll say export const create group is equal to mutation. The args will be an object with members equal to v.array of v.id of users. And then we have name, which is v.string, since we have to give a name to a group. And then handler is an async function which takes ctx and args. And then we will copy the identity stuff. So over here, we'll copy that and paste it in here. And then we'll just say const conversation id is equal to await ctx.db.insert into conversations. And what we want to insert is group true and name is args.name. Then once we have that id, we say await promise.all. And now what we want to do is go through every member of this conversation that we're adding and then create a new conversation members entity for them. So what we'll do is we'll create an array, take out all the args.members from the arguments that we have. So these are IDs of all the people which have to be added to the group. We will also add the current user to this group. Then we'll map through this array, which we just created. Async, we get the member ID. And in here we do await ctx.db.insert conversation members. And then here we pass in member ID and conversation ID. and save that. So that should allow us to create a group chat. Another thing we need to do is inside this get function over here, if we remember, we had a case for not conversation.isGroup, but we also need to do the else case of that in case there is a group chat. So we do else, we get const other members is equal to await promise dot all. We go through all conversation memberships, we filter through it. The membership.member ID is not equal to current user.id because we only want to get the other users. And we then map through each of them because a group chat will have multiple users. We'll say async membership const member is equal to await ctx.db.get. We get membership.member ID. If there is no member, we say throw new convex error and we say member could not be found. But if the member is found, we just return username with member.username. So then what we do is we return the conversation details, we return other members, which is the array we just made, and then for other member, we say null. And this is again because in both cases we want the similar keys. So we want other members and other member to be present both in the group case and the non-group case. It's just that one will be null in either of those. So that's it for the backend. Now we can get started with the front end where we create a dialog for adding the users present in the conversation. So to get started with the create group dialog, let's go into our app root conversations, and inside the components folder, we'll add a create group dialog.tsx and do tsrafce. And now that we made that, we'll just go inside layout.tsx. And for the item list over here for action, we will just call the create group dialog and just use that over here. And then we see we have the create group dialog over here. So let's get started with creating the component. Now, just a fair warning, this will be the largest component in our entire application, but after this, we'll be able to create groups. So this dialog is going to be a form where we'll be adding the users which should be present in the group. So firstly, as all forms, we have to create a schema for it. So we'll say const create group form schema. We'll say is equal to z, which we import from zod.object. The first field will be name, which is z.string dot min. It should be at least one, and the message should be this field can't be empty. And then we'll have a string of members. So we'll say members z.string.array dot min one. The message, in case there is less than one, is you must select at least one. Save that. Now in the beginning we want to use a hook, so let's just say use client. So the first thing we'll do is fetch the friends of the user. So we'll say const friends is equal to use query api.friends.get. Then we'll also use the mutation. So const mutate is equal to create group and pending is equal to use mutation state, and we pass in api.conversation.create group. Let's create the form. So const form is equal to use form, and by now you know how this is done. So we need to define the type. So we say z.infer type of create group form schema, an angle bracket, and then we close that. And then what we say here is that the resolver should be zod resolver of type create group form schema, and the default values should be name, which is empty string, and members, which is an empty array. And now we actually need the value of members live as it's updated because we want to render out which members have been selected and which haven't. So we'll just say const members is equal to form.watch, watch the members field, and use an empty array as default. And what this will do is it will basically update this constant whenever the form updates and we add new members. Then we want to keep a track of unselected friends. So we say use memo, which basically lets us keep track of a variable, but it only updates when certain other variables update. So we will say return, does friends exist? If it does, then we return friends.filter, get the friend, and we say the members array does not include friend.id. And of course, otherwise we return an empty array. And this depends on members.length as well as friends.length. So again, what we're doing here is we're keeping track of the unselected friends. So since members keeps track of the selected friends, of course, we filter out all those members by using not and dot includes, and then we find the unselected friends. Let's create the handle submit. So const handle submit is equal to async. Values is z.infer. type of create group form schema. If this is an arrow function, and we'll do await create group, pass in name equal to values dot name, members equal to values dot members, do a dot then arrow function. We do a form dot reset so that everything empties out once we click on submit, and we do a toast dot success and say group created. In the dot catch, we get the error. We say toast dot error. We check error instance of convex error. If it is, then we render error dot data. Otherwise, we render unexpected error occurred. So that's it for all the functions that we need right now. Now we can get started with the markup. So let's delete this and we say dialog from our components folder, tooltip from our components folder, tooltip trigger from our components folder. So we'll use a button inside here. It'll be of size icon and variant will be outline. Inside here, it'll also be a dialog trigger since we wanted to open up the dialog, and we'll say as child. And inside here, we will render the circle plus icon from Lucid React. And now we see the plus button open over here. For the tooltip content, we'll say it should be a P which says create. And in desktop mode now you'll see a tooltip when you hover over it. Below the tooltip, we'll say dialog content from the components folder. We'll name the class name as block, dialog header, dialog title. The title should be create group. Now let's just open up this dialog. As you see, the tooltip is there. We open it up and we have the dialog. Below that, we'll have the dialog description, and that will just say add your friends to get started. So we're done with the dialog header. In the body, we'll have the form from our form component. We'll pass in on submit. We'll say form dot handle submit and then pass in the handle submit function. And for class name, we'll say space y8. First child will be a form field, self-closing. Control is equal to form dot control. Name is equal to name. And this is just a simple input field. So render, we get in the first object, which is field, and we say take that and return form item. The form label should be name, and then in the form control, we'll say it should be an input. Placeholder should be group name dot dot dot, and then pass in whatever dot 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 field values we have and save that. And there we can see we have the group name field. So after this form field ends, we create another form field. Let's just copy all of the children inside it. So the name of this will be members. And for rendering this, we don't really need this field prop anymore. And that's because we won't be using a basic input element. We'll be using our own custom element. And for that, we can't just use the field prop that we get from here. So form item remains the same. For name, we write friends, form control, and then instead of input down here, we will actually be using a drop down menu. We will have a drop down menu trigger. It will be as child, and disabled will be equal to unselected friends dot length is equal to 0, because you don't have any more options in a drop down if there are no more unselected friends remaining. The child will be a button, class name will be w dash, and the variant will be equal to outline. And inside here we'll just say select. So we have the trigger. Now we need to make the content. So drop menu content. We'll give it a class name of w dash full. And what we'll do inside here is use unselected friends. We'll map through it. We'll get the friend. And for each of these, we'll return a drop down menu checkbox item. Each will have a key equal to friend.id, a class name of flex items center gap w full and p dash. And then the on checked change function. For that, we'll get the checked value, which is the current checked value or not. We'll say if checked. We'll do form dot set value, and we want to set the members value, and we want to set that equal to an array which contains dot 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 members, so the current members that are existing, but we also want to add friend.id. So inside the check menu item, we want to add an avatar. The class name will be w8h8. We will have an avatar image, which is self-closing. The src is equal to friend.image URL, and we close that over here. Let's just save that so it's all aligned properly. Below the avatar image, we have avatar fallback, and inside here we will render friend dot username dot substring 0, 1. And then after the avatar, we want to render out the username, so we'll say h4. We'll give it a class name of truncate, and in here we will render friend dot username. So we are done with the form, or at least the form field. So we want to render out the list of members which have been selected. So we'll check members and members dot length. So we just render null in both cases for now. So if they do exist, we want to render out a card. We'll give it a class name of flex items center gap overflow x auto wh24 p2 and no dash scroll bar. We will go through friends and we will filter it by saying take the current friend and members dot includes friend dot id, because keep in mind the members array only keeps the friend id, but the friends array keeps the details of that friend. Once we get this, we will say dot map get the friend at this index. We want to return a div, give it a key friend dot id, and give it a class name of flex call items center gap 1. We'll create another div inside here and give it a class name of relative. This will have an avatar, and let's just copy the content over here for what's inside the avatar. And then on top of that, we want to add a button using which somebody can delete the selected member and remove it from the selected list. So we use an X from Lucid React, give it a class name, text dash muted dash foreground, W4, H4, absolute, bottom 8, left 7, BG muted, rounded dash full, and cursor dash pointer. For on click, we want to do is form dot set value. We want to change the members field. We want to do members dot filter, get the ID, and if id is not equal to friend.id, then only add it to the list of members, otherwise just filter out the current one that's been clicked. And below this div, we also want to render out the name. So we'll say class name truncate text dash sm and do friend dot username dot split by the space in the middle of their name and only take in the first name by doing 0. So we have the section for rendering out the selected users, and now we have the footer of the dialog. So we will say dialog footer. We have a button whose disable value is equal to pending, type is equal to submit, and then we have create inside here. And that's it for the create group dialog. So over here we can write a name and try to create it. And we don't see the error message because we forgot to include it. So we'll go to the top over here where we had defined the input. And below the form control, we'll add a form message. And we'll go ahead and do that same thing for the dropdown. So below this form control, add the form message and save. And now we see it says you must select at least one friend and this field can't be empty. So let's just name it test group. Let's open up this dropdown and we can see a list of the friends the current user has. Let's add James and then we can see the list of the users that have been added. If we want to remove someone, we can just click on the cross and they're back here. We see that it's being filtered out, so the same user doesn't appear in both places. So let's add both of them, add the name, and then click on create. And we see group created. And just to verify, let's look at Convex. And we can see that we have an is group true and it's named test group. So now we are successfully able to create groups using the dialog. So now that we've created a group chat, we also want to be able to render it out in the conversations list. But if you remember, we're just rendering out null for now. So in the place where we created the DM conversation item, let's also create a group conversation item.tsx. And we'll just go inside the DM component and just copy everything and just replace the DM conversation item with group. Now the props will mostly remain the same, but instead of image URL, we'll just have the name. The outside href will remain the same. So will the avatar and the avatar image. We won't actually have any. Instead, we'll be using the avatar fallback option, and inside here we'll be rendering name.char at 0.to locale uppercase. And this function just takes whatever character we have and move it to uppercase based on which language is being written down. Same for this div. Instead of the username, we'll render out the name over here, and then everything else will remain the same. Now we go into layout.tsx, and let's just copy the DM conversation item component over here and just paste that. But instead of that, we'll have group conversation item, and instead of username, the key will be the same, so will be the ID. Instead of username, we'll have name, and that will be equal to conversation dot conversation. Remove the question mark and just use dot name. We don't have an image URL, and the last two remain the same. Let's save that. And now we see the test group over here. Now, one thing is that when we try to click on the item, we get redirected back, and that's because we have an error inside our conversation.ts. In conversation.ts, inside the get function, the dot map that we have over here, instead of being out all the way over here, it should be after the dot filter that we have over here, and save that. So now if we click on the conversation item, we actually see the group chat open over here. So now we have a group chat which works as normal as any other conversation. So we can say hi and our message gets sent, and the other users are able to see it. So now what we'll do is we'll add the option of being able to delete a group, which we have added beforehand, but we didn't add any functionality to that. So we'll be staying inside this conversation.ts for the backend. And to get us started, let's just go into friend.ts and copy the remove function that we made and just paste it at the bottom. And we'll just rename that to delete group. Mostly everything stays the same until the current user part. The memberships stuff remains the same as well as this check. Now, instead of getting the friendship, since we aren't deleting a friendship, we'll just get the messages, querying them by the conversation ID. We'll delete the memberships. We won't delete the friendship as we are over here, and we'll delete the messages as well. And that's basically all we have to do for deleting the group. Now let's add the front end functionality. So we'll go to the top, and inside the conversation ID folder, we'll open up slash components. And then in dialogues, we'll make another dialog. So we'll call it delete group dialog.tsx. And we'll copy the remove friend dialog over here and we'll paste that in, rename it to delete group dialog. So what changes is that instead of remove friend, we'll be using delete group. Instead of api.friend or remove, we'll be doing api.conversation.delete group. Again, we'll call the delete group function over here and say group deleted. The error part remains the same. The are you sure part remains the same as well. And then we'll just delete some parts of the description and we'll say you will not be able to message this group and full stop. And then instead of handle remove friend, it's handle delete group. And we'll just rename the function over here as well and save. Now we just need to render it. So let's go into page.tsx and we'll copy this remove friend dialog and below that paste the delete group dialog. And instead of the open being remove friend dialog open, it's delete group dialog open. And this should be set delete group dialog open. So now let's click on delete group. We get an are you sure message and then the description. And let's just cancel so we can close the dialog. And then now let's click on delete. And one thing we forgot to change in the backend is over here when we check the length, this should be equal to less than equal to 1 and save. So now if we try to delete the group and click on delete, we get group deleted and we get redirected back to the conversations list. And inside page.tsx, we're getting this issue where other member is optional. So we'll just add question marks in front of it and save. Now, lastly, we want to also be able to leave the group without deleting it. But before we carry on, there's one thing I remembered we needed to add. So we go into message.tsx, the component, and the place where we're rendering out the actual content, we want to add break-all to it as well. And this just handles another case where the text should wrap to the next line for narrower screens. Now let's open conversation.ts and let's just copy the delete group function and let's rename that to leave group. We'll do everything up until checking the memberships. Now, instead of getting all the membership, we just want to get the membership of the current user. And we say by underscore member ID underscore conversation ID. And we use that as the key. And then we have to check the member ID is equal to current user dot ID and then dot equal since it's a chained index and we use conversation ID is equal to args dot conversation ID. And then it'll be unique. So we only have one membership, which corresponds to a conversation and a user. We'll check if not membership, then we'll return you are not a member of this group. Otherwise, we just want to delete this membership. So we'll just delete all of the other stuff and we'll say await ctx.db.delete membership.id and save. Now again for the front end, we want to go and copy the content of delete group dialog and we'll rename it and we'll create a new component called leave group dialog.tsx and rename delete group dialog to leave group dialog. Instead of delete group, we use leave group for the function name as well as what we're importing and what we're using. Instead of group deleted, we say group left. The rest of the stuff remains, such as the title. And then instead of the second sentence, we will say you will not be able to see any previous messages or send new messages to this. And then instead of handle delete group, it'll be called handle leave group. And then let's rename this to leave as well. And now all we need to do is come to page.tsx, and on top of delete group dialog, let's just add leave group dialog, and this should be leave group dialog open, and this should be set leave group dialog open, and save. Let's just refresh. So now we're signed in as Jane. So let's click on the leave group option and we see the dialog. Of course, cancel closes it. And if we click on leave, we see that we're not a part of this group anymore and we see group left. But if we sign in as another user who was a part of this group, they still have this group and they can still see the previous messages, and they can also message in it. So that's about it for creating groups, leaving them, deleting them, and also sending and rendering the messages inside. In this section, we'll firstly be adding red receipts to all the messages in a conversation. And then we'll also be adding a small badge on the right-hand side of a conversation as well as down here in the nav bar. So to have red receipts, we first need to mark a certain message as red in the backend. So let's get started with the backend for this. So in Convex, we'll open up the conversation.ts folder. And let's just copy the leave group function over here since we'll be creating a new mutation. And we'll rename this to mark red. And then we need two arguments. Firstly is the conversation ID, but we also need the message ID. And that will be a v.id of messages. So we go down here and we check for the current user. We don't need the current conversation, but we do need the membership. And we'll be doing the same thing where we query by the member ID and the conversation ID. And then we say you aren't a member of this group if the membership is not present. But if it is present, we say const last message is equal to await ctx.db.get args.message ID. And then we'll say await ctx.db.patch, which means we're updating something. We'll update the membership of the current user to this conversation, and then we'll say last seen message. Does last message exist? We'll say last message.id if it does, otherwise. So essentially what we're doing here is that whenever a user opens up a conversation that they haven't looked at in some time, we'll assume that they've looked at the last message in the list of the conversation. We'll take the ID of that message and we'll send it to the mark red mutation in the backend. And then we'll just say for the membership of this current user to this conversation, update the last seen message field to the last message's ID. And if there is no last message in the conversation, just keep it as undefined. So that's it for the backend. In the next step, we'll be looking at calling this from the front end and rendering the red. So for the front end, we'll firstly open message.tsx, which is the component for rendering the messages. And then in the props, we'll add another prop, which is seen. It's optional and it's react.react node. We'll accept it over here as well. And then way down at the bottom, right before we call the avatar, in this div, we'll say seen. Next, we want to go into body.tsx and update the props here as well. So we want to add members prop, and that will be an object with last seen message ID, optional. It'll be an ID of type messages. It will also have an optional username field, which will be optional, and it will be of type string. And then it can have anything else inside here. So we'll just say key of string maps to a value of any type. And of course, this is an array of objects. So we'll define it here as well. So we'll destructure the props to get the members. And before we carry on, let's just pass this value inside the page. So we'll go into page.tsx and we see the red underline here already. So we're going to say members is equal to, and then first we check conversation.isGroup. Let's just put null for both cases now. So if it is group, we want to first check if conversation.other members. So if the conversation does have other members, then just send the conversation.other members. Otherwise, send an empty array. And then in case it's not a group, then we check conversation.other member, singular. And if the person is there, then we'll create an array and only put the conversation.other member inside there. Otherwise, we'll pass an empty array. So in either case, we want to pass in an array. And since other member is just a singular entity, we pass it inside an array. So now let's go inside body.tsx and actually use this prop. So firstly, whenever you open up the body of a conversation, we want to mark the last message as red. So we'll say const mutate mark red is equal to use mutation state api.conversation.mark red. And then whenever we load this component, we want to call it. So we'll say use effect and just put the boilerplate of a use effect. Inside here, we'll check if messages and messages.length is greater than 0. Then we'll call the mark red function. We'll pass in the conversation ID, and then for the message ID, we'll pass in messages 0.message.id. And it's 0 because the first element inside this list is actually the latest element. We're just rendering it in the reverse order. And then for the dependency array, we have messages.length, and we have conversation ID, and we have the mark read function. So now whenever a message gets sent, we want to keep track of who all have seen that message. And below a message, we want to render out if that was the last message that a particular user saw. So we'll go down here, and after this last by user, we'll say const seen message is equal to, we check if it's the current user, then we do get seen message, message dot underscore ID. Otherwise, we do undefined because we only want to show the read receipts to the user for only their own messages. Now we have to define this function, so we'll go before the return statement. We'll say const get seen message, take in the message ID, which is of type ID of messages. It'll be an arrow function. And then we'll say const seen users is equal to members dot filter, take the member, and member dot last seen message ID is equal to message ID. So we're going through all the members in the conversation, and we're just filtering out the ones for whom this message was the last seen message. Then we'll do dot map, take the user, and we'll do user dot username. We'll assert that it exists, and we'll do dot split by space, and we'll get the 0 substring. So that'll be the first name. Then we'll say if seen users dot length is equal to 0, return undefined. Otherwise, return format seen by and then seen users. We need to create this function as well. But before that, let's go down here and then pass in the scene prop that we defined, and we'll pass in scene message, which we just calculated, and save. Now let's go ahead and define this format seen by function. So over here, we'll say const format seen by is equal to, take in the names, which is an array of string. We'll do an arrow function, and we'll do a switch case on names dot length, since we want to show different types of messages for the different length of names. So if there's only one user, then we just return a p tag, give the class name of text muted foreground, text dash sm, text dash right, and inside we'll say seen by, and then pass in names 0. For case of 2, let's just copy what we have here, and then in the string here we'll just say and then pass in names 1. And then the default case, which is anything larger than that, we want to show just the first 2 users, and then we want to render a tooltip which will show the remaining ones. So we'll say return tooltip provider. Inside we'll create the tooltip. Firstly, we'll have the tooltip trigger, which will be a p with the same class name as above. So let's just copy and paste that. And then we'll inside here we'll say seen by names of 0, comma names of 1, comma, and we'll pass in the number of remaining users, so names dot length minus 2 more. So that'll just render out this text for the tooltip, and then in the actual content, we'll say tooltip content. We'll create an unordered list. We'll do names dot map name and index, and then we'll return an li with key equal to index, and then inside here we'll render out the name. So we have our read receipts. Now let's test them out. So let's start a conversation with Jane. Let's say hi. And there's no read receipt right now, but let's open up this conversation. And now we see it says seen by Jane. And of course, it doesn't show it over here because from Jane's view, James sent this message and she's not the owner of that message, so she can't see the read receipts. Let's say hi over here as well. And you can see that the read receipt here has been updated. Now, the last feature we'll be making before we deploy this application is a way to see if there are any unread messages in a conversation. So to do that, firstly, we'll go into the backend. For conversation.ts, all we have to do is we have to go to the get query over here. And then when we're returning stuff in the end, we just want to return an underscore ID field with member dot underscore ID. Then in conversations plural.ts, we'll go into the get query over down here where we're defining const last message. And then over here, we'll say const last seen message is equal to conversation memberships index dot last seen message. Does it exist? Then do await ctx.db.get conversation memberships this index dot last seen message and assert that it exists. Otherwise, do null. So for the current conversation that we're looking at, we've gotten the membership of the user and then the last seen message. And then we've gotten the details of that last seen. Then we calculate the time of the last seen message. We say last seen message time is equal to last seen message that exists, then last seen message dot creation time, which is given to us by Convex. Otherwise, we can do -1 by default. So now that we know when the last message that the user saw for this conversation was created, any message that came after that is unseen by the user. So we just fetch all those messages. So we'll say const unseen messages is equal to await ctx.db.query. We will query the messages table. We'll say dot with index by conversation ID, and then we'll say q dot equal conversation ID, and it should be equal to conversation dot ID. Then we'll do dot filter, take q and say q dot gt, which means greater than q dot field underscore creation time, and then next to that last seen message time. So this basically means get all of the messages belonging to the current conversation and filter them by a creation time that is greater than last seen message time. We'll filter that again. So dot filter q and q dot neq, which means not equal, q dot field sender ID and current user dot ID. So of course the last seen message should be by another user and not the current user, so we filter out for that, and then we do dot collect. And then over here, when we're returning this object, we will also say unseen count is equal to unseen messages dot length, and we'll just do the same thing by copying it and pasting it down over here. So now that we have the backend done, let's change up the use navigation hook, because again, this is where we have the configuration for the count, which gets shown at the bottom. So let's go here, and below requests count, we'll say const conversation is equal to use query api.conversations.get. Const unseen messages count is equal to use memo. And then inside here, we want to say return conversations dot reduce. Reduce is a function where you can go through an array and then accumulator, which contains the value which is being accumulated, and then the current value. We'll return acc plus current dot unseen count. And then we have to give an initial value, and we'll do 0 for that. And then the dependency array is conversation. So again, this function is just going through all of the conversations and then adding up the unseen count into this accumulator variable, which gets returned into unseen message. We go down here, and then for the conversations page, the count will be unseen messages count. And then down here, we will replace, and then down here, we'll just add the new unseen messages count variable. So as a test, let's just go into this test group and just say hi. Now that should be showing a badge on the bottom left as well as on the right, which it isn't right now because we haven't added the markup for that. So let's get started with that. And sorry, this should be count, and we'll just remove this console log here as well and save that. And now we see we actually do have the badge being rendered out over here, but we don't have it in the conversations list. So let's just go and add that. So we'll open up the layout.tsx inside our conversations folder. And then for each of the types of items, we will pass in an unseen count prop, and that'll be equal to conversation dot unseen count. Let's just do it for both. Save. Let's begin with the DM conversation item. We'll take an unseen count, which is a number, and then we'll go to the bottom of this card and then say unseen count, render out a badge, and render out unseen count inside that. Otherwise, just null. Of course, nothing happens right now because we added the message to the group. So we'll go into the group and do the same thing where we'll take an unseen count, which is a number, take it in over here, and then way at the bottom, check unseen count. If it does exist, badge, unseen count inside. Otherwise, and my bad, instead of having gap 4 and truncate over here inside this card, all we need is justify dash. So now we see we have the badge both on the bottom and on the right over here. Let's click on the conversation, and we've read the messages now. And if we go back, we don't have that anymore. And we can see it also works for a private conversation. So let's say hi over here, and we just have to make that styling change again. So we'll go into DM conversation item, and for this card on top over here, we'll remove gap 4 and truncate, and all we have to add is justify dash, and there we go. Let's click on this conversation, and if we go back, it's gone. So that's it for read receipts and unseen messages counts. And that's the last feature we'll be adding for the free version of this course. Now all that's left remaining is to deploy our website so that our friends and everybody else can see what. So we're done with coding our real-time chat application, at least the basic features for it, and we're ready to deploy it to the internet. Now the first thing we need to do is change the icon on the top over here as well as the title, because these are what come default with Next.js. So let's get started with the icon first. What you'll need to do is go to a website like favicon.io and upload a PNG version of our logo that we have over here. So we have the SVG, So you'll need to find an online converter to convert that into PNG and then upload it over here. So I've uploaded the PNG and then I can just click on download and then it downloads all of the files related to the favicon. And all you need to do is drag and drop your new favicon.ico that you downloaded and paste it over here. And there we see we have the icon for our chat application. And then let's just open up layout.tsx and rename this the title to chat app and rename the description to real-time chat app using Next.js and save that. And now we see that the title has updated. The logo hasn't, but once we deploy it, you'll be able to see that the logo has updated. So the next step that we need to do is we need to go inside chat app and we'll firstly be uploading all of our code to GitHub, which you should be doing anyways, so that all your code is safely backed up. So we'll do git init and that initializes our current folder as a Git repository. Then we'll open up github.com and then we'll just create a new repository. We'll name it chat-app and we'll make it private. And we'll just click on create repository. And then we'll go down to the section where it says push an existing repository from the command line, copy that and paste it all down here and click on enter. And then if we refresh, we'll see that all of our code has been pushed to GitHub. Now we also want to put the latest changes, so we'll just write down git add dot, so that adds everything. We'll do git commit -m add chat app, and we do git push origin main. And that will push all of our latest changes after committing them. So if we refresh now, we'll see that it has our latest commit with all of the files that we just made. Now let's go into the Convex docs, which tell us how to deploy. And the service we'll be using to deploy is Vercel, and Vercel is the company that actually made Next.js. And they have a very useful and nice service where you can easily deploy your Next.js apps using your GitHub repo. So the Convex docs tell us to create a Vercel account. So we go to the link that's given to us and it'll take you to the website where you'll either have to log in using your GitHub or your Google account. You can see I have a few applications already present. And then it tells us to link our project to Vercel. So we'll go over here and we'll click on add new and add a new project. And since I logged in with GitHub, it already has a list of my Git repositories. And since we just made chat app, that's the one we want to import. So I'll click on import. The project name is fine. Everything else is fine. For the build and output settings, if we go back to the documentation, it says override the build command to whatever is given here. So we'll do that, go back. And then for the build command, we'll just click on override and paste that in. For the environment variables, we want to paste in all the variables we'll be needing. So firstly, we need to go into the Convex dashboard and get the Convex deploy key. So let's go into Convex dashboard. Now you'll notice that we have a dev environment over here. If you're deploying to production, you'll usually want to switch to the production option over here. So you'll want to move to production. Just keep in mind that it will have different keys, which you'll need to copy and paste into Vercel separately. I'll just carry on with development for now. So what I need to do is go into settings and then for show development credentials, I'll click on that. And then I'll click on generate development key. And then I'll copy that and go into Vercel and then paste in the value and then we'll copy the key that it's telling us to use over here and we'll paste that here. Make sure there's no space at the end of it and click on add. For the rest of the other values, we'll go to .env.local and just copy everything and just paste that in into this input field. And there we have all the environment variables that we need to deploy. And now what we can do is just go ahead and click on this big deploy button. And this will automatically deploy everything for us. Keep in mind that if you make any changes to your code, all you need to do is commit your changes and then push them to your repository. And Vercel will automatically start a new build of your entire application and it should be updated within a few minutes. And now hopefully this doesn't happen to you, but it did for me where the build actually failed. And if we open it up, it actually tells us which part of the build failed. And this is why it's usually a good idea to run npm run build locally before you push it to Vercel. So what happened over here is that this line should not be from @clerk slash nextjs slash whatever. It should actually be from @clerk slash backend. So we save that. Now to update these changes, we'll do git add, git commit -m, fix import error, and we do git push origin main, and that should automatically push it to our Vercel instance as well. So if we refresh, we'll just need to do the pasting again. So let me just do that for now. I'll add this and then from .env, I'll just copy paste everything as well again. And then I'll click on, before I click on deploy, I'll add that command as well that we needed to. So copy this. And for this, we'll do the override and paste this. And then we click on deploy. Okay, so if everything went smoothly, you should see this page, this congratulations page, where we have some details about our application. So let's just go to the dashboard and find out where it's been deployed. So over here, if you go down, you'll see the deployment URL. So we'll just copy this domain over here and let's go to our other browser that we've been using and let's just paste it. And of course, the first thing we'll see is the Clerk login screen. So let's continue with Google and let's just sign in. And as we can see, we have the same backend. So we have all the data from before, but now the URL is in localhost. It's the vercel.app. So now you can just copy this link and share it with your friends or whoever wants to see what you made, add it to your resume, and then they'll be able to use your application, send friend requests, change it from light to dark theme, and then message inside conversations as well. So you'll see that the URL over here has the Vercel branding to it, but if you want to add a custom domain, we'll take a look at that in the next. So if you don't want the Vercel URL in your application, you will have to buy a custom domain, and the best domain provider that I've been using until now is domain.com. I highly recommend their service, and if you use the link down below in the description, you can also get a 10% discount off of whatever domain you buy. So all you need to do is enter your domain over here, search for it, and then if it's available, you can purchase it. And once you've purchased a domain, you'll be able to access the domain dashboard over here. So once you can do that, we can move on with adding a custom domain to our Vercel deployment. So you'll need to go into Vercel and go to whichever application you made right now and go into the settings tab and click on domains. Now it just has the default domain that Vercel made for us, but then we can add whatever custom domain we added right now. So I'll add the one that I own and click on add, and it'll give us a bunch of options. The best thing to do is to just go with the recommended one and click on add. Now it just worked for me by default and you can see the blue ticks over here. But if this is the first time you're adding a custom domain in Vercel, what you need to do is go into the domain.com dashboard and go into the DNS page, which should be available inside the hamburger menu. And the name servers you'll see down here probably won't be the same. So what you need to do is you need to delete them and then copy and paste this ns1.vercel-dns.com and ns2.vercel-dns.com. Once you've done that, that change will take time to propagate across the entire internet. It could take up to 24 hours, but once 24 hours are over, you should see these blue ticks over here. And then whichever domain you entered, you can just copy that. And let me just go to the other browser. If you paste it, it'll take you to your application that you just deployed to Vercel. And if you do continue with Google, you should be logged in into your Vercel application, but if you see the domain, it will be what you purchased from domain.com. So that is it for this tutorial. You learned how to make a real-time chat application where you can add friends, message them, create groups and message in the groups as well. You also learned how to use Shadcn and how to easily add a dark mode to your application and how to protect all of this behind Clerk and use Convex DB as your database. This isn't all though. If you purchase the paid version of this course, you will also be able to see how to add an emoji picker, how to do file uploads for images, videos, and PDF files, how to do audio and video calls as well, and how to convert this into a progressive web app, which means you can download this onto your desktop as well as your phone and use it as a native application without making any changes to your code. So if you're interested in that, check out the link in the description down below. Otherwise, thank you for watching. Please do subscribe, and in the comments down below, let me know if you would like to see any other topics covered on this channel. Thanks for watching and bye.